Hey there, seekers. Tonight we're cracking open a theory blowing up across Christian YouTube right now, and it might completely rewire the way you picture Jesus. It's called kenosis, and the claim is bold enough to make a theology professor spit out his coffee. That Jesus healed the blind, raised the dead, and calmed a screaming storm all as an ordinary human, without ever tapping a single drop of his own divine power. If that's true, everything changes. Scholars branded the idea heresy for 150 years and buried it. But millions just dug it back up, asking one nervous question: what if the experts got it wrong? Tonight we put it on trial, so before we dive in, smash that like button if this is your kind of rabbit hole, and drop a comment. What city are you watching from, and what time is it there right now? I really want to know who's riding along tonight. Now dim the lights and let's roll. So let us start where the mystery actually begins, which is not in a dusty seminary or a comment section, but on a crowded dirt street in a fishing town on the shore of Galilee. Strip away the stained glass and the soft organ music for a second and just picture the logistics. A man named Jesus is trying to get somewhere, and he is trying to get there fast. A local synagogue official named Jairus has just thrown himself at his feet, because Jairus has a little girl at home who is dying and every minute counts. So Jesus starts moving toward the house, and the entire town seems to have decided to come along for the walk. If you have ever tried to cross a packed subway platform at rush hour while carrying 2 bags of groceries and a genuine sense of urgency, you already understand the physics of this scene better than most Sunday school flannel graphs ever admitted. It is chaos. People are pressing in from every side, everyone wants to see him, everyone wants a piece of him, and nobody is particularly worried about his personal space. And in the middle of that human traffic jam, there is a woman. We are told she has been bleeding for 12 years. 12 years. Take a moment with that number because it does a lot of quiet work. Under the purity codes of the day, a condition like hers did not just make her sick, it made her socially radioactive. She would have been considered unclean, which meant that for over a decade, more or less anyone she touched became ceremonially unclean too, which meant that the sensible, respectable thing for her to do in a crowd this dense was to stay very far away from it. She has, the text tells us, spent everything she had on doctors and gotten steadily worse, which is a detail that has aged with grim relatability. So here she is, doing the one thing she is absolutely not supposed to do, wading into a wall of bodies, keeping her head down, betting the last of her hope on a single desperate idea. If she can just reach him, if she can just get close enough to touch the hem of his cloak, the tassel on the edge of his outer garment, she is convinced that will be enough. She reaches, she touches, and immediately we are told something in her body changes. The bleeding stops. 12 years over in an instant from a fistful of fabric. That alone would make a decent story. The quiet miracle in the corner of a bigger errand. The kind of thing that could have slipped by unnoticed. Except it does not slip by unnoticed. And this is where the whole evening actually turns, because the next thing that happens is the thing nobody quite knows what to do with. Jesus stops. In the middle of the crush, in the middle of his rush to save a dying child, he stops dead and he asks a question. He wants to know who touched him. Now, on the surface, that is an almost comically bad question to ask in that particular setting. Half the town is currently touching him. His own disciples, who are not always the most tactful group, basically say as much. They look around at the crowd mashing in on every side, at the elbows and shoulders and general full contact enthusiasm, and they point out, with what you have to imagine is a certain amount of restraint, that asking who touched you in a mob like this is not exactly a narrow field of suspects. It is a little like standing in the middle of a sold-out stadium and demanding to know who breathed. And yet Jesus does not drop it. He keeps looking around. He is not asking about the crowd. He felt something specific. He felt, the text says plainly, power go out of him. Sit with that phrasing because it is the loose thread this entire investigation is going to pull. Power went out of him. Not power that he decided to send, not a switch he flipped, but something that left him and that he noticed leaving. The way you might notice a draft when a door opens behind you. He knows something happened. He knows a real transaction took place. And still, in that same breath, he does not seem to know who was on the other end of it. He scans the faces, he waits, and eventually the woman, trembling, terrified, understanding that she has been caught, comes forward and falls down and tells him the whole truth. And do not lose track of what he is standing in the middle of while he does this. There is a child dying across town, and the clock that Jairus is watching has not paused just because a stranger reached out of the crowd. By any ordinary measure, this is the worst possible moment to halt the whole procession and open an inquiry into who tapped your cloak. A man racing to save a life does not, as a rule, freeze in place to solve a mystery he could easily just let go. And yet he stops anyway, which tells you something. Whatever he felt was strong enough to override an emergency. It was not faint background noise he could brush off on his way to more important business. It was significant enough to pull his full attention off a dying girl, which means that to him, a piece of something had just left without his permission, and that mattered a great deal. Here is the part that should stop you, and it is so easy to read straight past it because we have all heard the story roughly 900 times. If Jesus is fully God, and if God, as the scriptures elsewhere insist, knows the hearts of every human being, sees the sparrow fall, numbers the hairs on your head, and generally does not need to be briefed on anything, then why on earth is he asking who touched me? Why is he standing in a crowd, genuinely looking, genuinely waiting, apparently missing a piece of information that an all-knowing being should already have on file? You cannot both know everything and need to ask. Those two things do not fit in the same sentence, and yet the story hands them to us stapled together and expects us to keep reading. Most people, when they bump into this little snag, do one of two things. They either smooth it over so fast they barely register it, or they never notice the snag at all, because we are extremely good at hearing familiar stories without actually listening to them. But the snag is real, and it is not a one-off. That is the thing this whole video is built on. This scene by the sea is not a strange, isolated glitch in an otherwise seamless portrait. It is one thread in a pattern, and once you learn to see the pattern, you cannot unsee it. There are dozens of moments scattered across the Gospels where Jesus seems to bump up against a wall, a limit, an edge, a place where he does not know something, cannot do something, has to wait for something, or plainly runs out of something. And for most of Christian history, believers have quietly filed those moments in a drawer marked "Do not open," precisely because opening the drawer raises a question that goes straight to the center of everything. Because make no mistake about the stakes here. This is not a fun bit of trivia to pull out at dinner parties, assuming you go to dinner parties where people discuss the metaphysics of the incarnation, in which case, respect. This is the load-bearing wall. Who exactly was Jesus? Was he God pretending to be a man who got promoted to God, some blend of the two, or something the human brain is not really built to hold? Every answer you give to a small question like "Who touched me?" quietly commits you to a much bigger answer about the nature of Christ himself. And that bigger answer shapes how you read every page of the Gospels, and if you happen to be a Christian, what it even means to try to follow this person. So the little detail is not little. That is the whole trick of tonight. The thing that looks like a throwaway line, a minor awkwardness the narrator forgot to tidy up, is going to turn out to be the key that unlocks the entire theory. And here is my promise to you before we go any further. Almost everyone who wrestles with this scene lands on one of two tidy explanations. And both of those explanations, as we are about to see, have a hidden crack running right through the middle of them. Tonight we are not going to settle for either one. We are going to walk carefully down a third path, one that the church spent a century and a half calling a heresy, before millions of people decided to take a second look. But we cannot appreciate the third path until we have honestly, fairly, and without any cheap shots understood the first two. So let us go meet them. The first standard answer is the one you have probably heard from a pulpit, and it is the more popular of the two by a wide margin. It goes like this. Of course, Jesus knew who touched him. He knew before she reached out. He knew her name, her 12 years of suffering, the exact color of the thread on the hem of his cloak, and everything else, because he is God, and God knows all of it. He asked who touched me not because he lacked the information, but because he wanted her to come forward. She had received her healing in secret, quietly, almost like she was stealing it. And if he had simply let her melt back into the crowd, she would have walked away physically well, but still hidden, still ashamed, still treating herself like a woman who had to sneak her blessing when nobody was looking. So he stopped everything and asked the question to draw her out, to give her the chance to stand up in front of the whole town and say, out loud, that it was her and that she believed and that she was well. On this reading, the question is not ignorance, it is an invitation. It pulls her out of the shadows, lets her confess her faith in public, singles her out from a crowd that had been treating her like part of the scenery, and lets everyone watching see plainly where his power comes from and what it can do. It is, honestly, a beautiful reading. It is pastorally warm, it protects the doctrine of God knowing everything, and it turns an awkward question into a tender act of dignity. And it comes at a price. That is the part people rush past. If Jesus already knew the complete answer to every question he asked, then the question was, in the most literal sense, theater. A very kind and well-motivated piece of theater, sure, but theater all the same. It means he is standing in a crowd performing curiosity he does not feel, scanning faces he has already identified, asking who did this while knowing full well who did this in order to produce an effect. And the trouble is, once you decide he is doing that in this scene, you have to wonder how much else he is doing it in. Every question he ever asks starts to feel a little staged. Every moment of apparent not knowing becomes a teaching device rather than a real experience. And slowly, without meaning to, you have turned the most human figure in the entire library of human religion into something closer to an actor who has read the whole script in advance and is just hitting his marks, gently steering everyone toward the lesson while never once being genuinely surprised, genuinely uncertain, or genuinely at a loss. It protects his divinity beautifully. It just quietly nibbles at his humanity, one question at a time. And maybe that sounds like a purely academic worry, the sort of thing only professional theologians get worked up about at conferences with bad coffee. It is not, and here is why it reaches all the way down to you. If Jesus faced his life the way we face ours, not knowing how it would turn out, feeling the fear without a script tucked in his back pocket, then his courage means something, his trust means something, his choices cost him something real. But if he knew every outcome in advance, if every hard moment arrived with the ending already spoiled, then his life starts to look less like a road he actually walked and more like a film whose star has read the final page. The gap between those two versions of him is enormous, and it changes what it could possibly mean to follow him. So this is not trivia. This is the whole shape of the thing. The second standard answer takes the opposite fork in the road, and it is the one that makes a lot of devout people distinctly uncomfortable, which is exactly why it is so interesting. This reading says the obvious thing. Maybe he asked because he did not know. Maybe the question was a real question, the kind you and I ask when we actually want the answer. Maybe he felt the power leave, registered that a genuine exchange had occurred, and turned to find out who had been on the receiving end. Because in that instant, in his human experience, he did not have that particular fact loaded and ready. It is the reading that takes the plain words of the story at face value, and there is something bracingly honest about it. The problem, of course, is that it appears to drive a spike straight through his divinity. If he did not know, then he was not all-knowing, at least not in that moment. And if he was not all-knowing in that moment, a great many carefully built theological towers start to sway. So most people back away from this answer quickly, the way you back away from a step that creaks a little too much, and they retreat to the safety of the first reading, the theater reading, because at least that one keeps all the doctrines standing. But here's where I want to slow everything down, because both of those answers, the tender theater one and the honest but scary one, share a blind spot. They are so busy arguing about whether Jesus knew who touched him that they both walk right past the strangest detail in the whole scene. Neither of the two standard explanations has anything useful to say about the power that went out of him. And that detail, once you really look at it, does not fit comfortably in either box. Think about what that phrasing actually implies. Power went out of him. Not power was displayed, not power was commanded, but power departed as though from a supply. It is the language of something being drawn down. It suggests, at least on its face, that whatever Jesus was carrying around inside him functioned less like an infinite ocean and more like a tank, a reservoir, a battery, something with a level that can drop when you draw on it. He felt it leave because there was a measurable amount of it, and now there was slightly less. That is a genuinely bizarre thing to say about the power of an infinite God, because an infinite God does not run low. You cannot make a dent in infinity. If the source were bottomless, he would not feel a thing when one woman took a sip from it, any more than the ocean flinches when you fill a cup at the shore. But he felt it. He noticed. Something finite was touched, and it registered. And there is something almost unbearably human buried in that little word, felt. He did not deduce that power had left him by working out the theology of the situation, and he did not consult some divine ledger. He felt it, the way you feel your phone buzz in your pocket, the sensation arriving before any explanation for it, which means that whatever else was going on, some part of Jesus was experiencing the whole event from the inside, in real time, as a thing that happened to him rather than a thing he calmly arranged. He is not narrating the miracle from a control room somewhere above the clouds. He is down in the room, caught off guard by the draft, turning around to find the open window. That is a very strange posture for an infinite being to be in, and it is exactly the posture the two tidy answers never quite account for, because both of them are so fixated on the question of knowing that they forget to ask about the feeling. That single clue, the idea of a finite, drawable supply of power, is the scent we are going to be tracking for the rest of this investigation. Hold on to it. Because the two standard answers are not really just two answers to one little question. They are the tip of something much larger. They are, in fact, a preview of two enormous camps that have been quietly at war over the nature of Christ for centuries. And the argument on that crowded street is a miniature of an argument that has run through cathedrals and councils and seminaries for the better part of 2,000 years. And underneath both camps, if you dig down far enough, you find two instincts that are each, on their own, completely correct. The first instinct wants to protect his divinity at all costs, to make absolutely sure we never accidentally shrink him down into a merely wise teacher, a gifted rabbi, a good man with a knack for crowds. That instinct is guarding something precious, and it is right to guard it. The second instinct wants to protect his humanity just as fiercely, to make sure we never turn him into a costume, a divine being wearing a man's suit and only pretending to be one of us. That instinct is also guarding something precious, and it is also right. The whole drama of the next 2,000 years is really the story of people trying to hold both of those instincts at once without letting go of either, and discovering over and over just how maddeningly hard that is to do. Before we get anywhere near the theory that ties it all together, we owe it to both of those camps to build their strongest cases honestly. No straw men, no cheap wins. But first, we need more clues, because one strange moment by the sea is a curiosity. A whole pattern of strange moments is a case. So let us build the case file, and rather than dumping every odd detail into one giant heap, which would be about as useful as a detective throwing every scrap of evidence into a single box and shaking it, let us sort the clues into categories. There are roughly 5 kinds of limit that show up on Jesus again and again across the Gospels, and each one deserves its own folder. Start with the most obvious and least controversial. Start with the body. Nobody in 2,000 years has really lost sleep over the fact that Jesus had a body that behaved like a body. He got hungry. Famously, at the very start of his public life, he goes out into the wilderness and does not eat for 40 days. And the text does not tiptoe around what happens next. Afterward, unsurprisingly, he was hungry. Not spiritually peckish, hungry in the way a person is hungry when they have not eaten in an extremely long time. Later on the road near a village called Bethany, he passes a fig tree, looking for something to eat, and the whole little episode only makes sense because he genuinely wanted breakfast, and there genuinely was not any. He got thirsty too. Near the end, on the cross, one of the few things he says is simply that he thirsts, which is not the sort of thing you announce for dramatic flair. And earlier, sitting worn out by a well in Samaria in the heat of the day, he asks a woman drawing water if she will give him a drink, for the very ordinary reason that he was thirsty and she had a bucket and he did not. He got tired, which is its own quiet miracle if you think about it, the maker of everything nodding off. There's a storm on the lake, a bad one, waves coming over the sides, seasoned fishermen genuinely afraid they're about to drown. And where is Jesus? Asleep. In the back of the boat, on a cushion, out cold, sleeping so soundly through a squall that they have to wake him. That is not the sleep of a man play-acting exhaustion. That is the sleep of someone who is completely, physically wiped out. Same story at that well in Samaria, where the text tells us he was worn out from the journey, which is why he sat down in the first place while the others went to buy food. And of course he felt pain, real pain. The whole grim account of his final hours turns on a body that could be hurt and did not enjoy it. a body that flinched and bled and suffered exactly as any human body would. And there is a reason nobody argues about this folder, a reason worth saying out loud. If Jesus only seemed to get hungry, only appeared to be tired, only went through the outward motions of thirst while feeling nothing at all, then the whole project collapses into a kind of elaborate pantomime. A God who cosplays humanity from a safe distance has not actually joined us in anything. He has merely done a very convincing impression. So the church dug in its heels on the body early and hard. Whatever else is up for debate, the hunger was real, the exhaustion was real, the pain was real. The catch is that once you have admitted the body was fully, unfaked, genuinely human, it gets awkward to turn around and insist that everything above the neck was quietly running on infinite divine horsepower the entire time. If the stomach was real, why not the not knowing? That is precisely the crack the later folders are going to widen. None of that troubles anyone. Every branch of the church, every camp in our 2,000-year argument happily agrees that Jesus was hungry and thirsty and tired and could feel pain, because a religion built on the idea that God became a real human being kind of falls apart if that human being was secretly immune to lunchtime. So we put the body clues in folder 1 and move on, because the folders are about to get more interesting. Folder 2 is space. And this one is subtler, but once you notice it, it is everywhere. Jesus is stuck in one location at a time, like the rest of us. He does not blink between towns. He walks on foot for miles over dusty roads in sandals, and getting anywhere takes him exactly as long as it would take you. He cannot be in two places at once. If he is teaching in one village, he is not simultaneously across the lake in another. The most striking example of this is the death of his friend Lazarus. Word comes that Lazarus is sick, and Jesus, for reasons of his own, does not rush. He arrives days later, and by the time he gets there, his friend has already been in the tomb for 4 days. Notice the shape of that. He arrives, he gets there. He is described essentially as being late, bound by the same clock and the same map as everyone else, unable to simply be present at the bedside the moment he was needed. A being with no spatial limits does not arrive anywhere, because a being with no spatial limits is already everywhere. But this one travels. This one shows up after the fact at a specific place, having covered a specific distance at walking speed. And the Lazarus delay is stranger still the longer you sit with it, because it was not that he simply chose to arrive late in some abstract way. Coming sooner would have meant being in a place he was not. He was somewhere else, doing something else. And reaching his dying friend meant a journey with a duration across ground that had to be physically covered one step at a time. The grief of the sisters when he finally turns up carries a quiet accusation folded into it. The ache of if only you had been here. And the whole scene only lands with that weight because he was, in fact, not there, and could not simply will himself into the room. Folder 3 is time, and here the clues get quietly startling. There is a line early in his life that says he grew in wisdom and in stature, which is a strange thing to say about someone if that someone already knew everything from the cradle. You do not grow in wisdom if you were born with all of it. Growing implies a starting point that was less and an ending point that was more. A learning curve, a process that took, well, time. He also talks about time the way a person embedded in it talks. He speaks of doing his work today and tomorrow and finishing on the third day. He tells his mother at a wedding that his hour has not yet come, as if there is a schedule he is moving along, a timing he is subject to rather than standing outside of. These are the words of someone living inside the river of time, feeling the current, waiting for the right moment, not someone hovering above the whole timeline reading it like a page. There is a tenderness in that image we tend to skip right over. A child who grows in wisdom is a child who once did not know how to tie a knot or read a scroll or reason his way through a hard problem, and then learned step by step the way children do. If those words mean what they plainly say, then there was a version of this person who had to be taught things, who asked his mother what a word meant, who got a little better at something the more he practiced it. That is either a staggering truth about how far God was willing to stoop, or it is a line we are forced to explain away. And which of those it turns out to be depends entirely on how we end up reading the whole case file. Folder 4 is where the Orthodox start to shift a little in their seats, because Folder 4 is knowledge, and the clues here are harder to wave away. We already met the big one on the crowded street, the not knowing who touched him. But it is far from alone. In one wrenching scene, a father brings his tormented son to Jesus, and before doing anything, Jesus asks the man a simple, practical, information-gathering question. How long has this been happening to him? That is not a rhetorical question. That is the question a doctor asks when taking a history, because the answer is not yet in hand. On another day, faced with an enormous, hungry crowd and not much food, he asks his disciples how many loaves they have, and then sends them to go count, which is a peculiar thing to do if the number is already sitting in your omniscience. Standing outside the tomb of that same friend Lazarus, grieving, he asks the people around him where they have laid the body. Where have you put him? He does not know the spot, or at least he asks as though he does not. And most staggering of all, in the middle of a long teaching about the end of things, he says flatly that nobody knows the day or the hour, not the angels, and then he adds 3 words that have made theologians sweat for centuries. Not even the Son. He puts himself by name on the list of those who do not know something. Read that slowly because it is not a small admission. He is not confessing ignorance about some minor trivia, the batting average of a Galilean fisherman, or the number of sheep in a distant field. He is saying he does not know the single most important date on the entire calendar of the universe, the day of his own return, the moment the whole story he keeps talking about finally arrives. And he says it in the same breath in which he affirms that his Father does know it. 2 beings, 1 crucial piece of information, and only one of them holding it. You can spend a lifetime trying to make that sentence comfortable and never quite manage it. There's even a line in one of the New Testament letters that says, "He learned obedience through what he suffered, and you cannot learn what you already fully possess." Learning is what finite minds do. Folder 4 is full of a person who asks real questions and grows into real knowledge. And that is a harder folder to explain away than a rumbling stomach. And then there is folder 5, which is the one that makes everyone genuinely nervous, because folder 5 is power. Remember, power is the whole reason we are here, the finite reservoir, the thing that went out of him by the sea. Well, there is one scene that turns the volume all the way up. Jesus goes home. He goes back to his own hometown, the place where he grew up, where everyone knew him as the local craftsman, the kid who used to work with his hands, and he starts to teach. And the reaction is not admiration, but offense. "Who does this guy think he is?" they mutter. "We watched him grow up." And the text tells us something remarkable about what happened next. It says he could not do any mighty work there, except that he laid his hands on a few sick people and healed them. Could not chose not to, not decided the moment was not right. The word the original language uses is the language of inability, of a thing that was not possible. And that is a wildly different claim from the polite version people usually reach for, which is that he simply declined. There is a version of that sentence that says he would not, that he held back on purpose. That is not the version we got. We got could not, and the difference between could not and would not is the difference between a locked door and an open one you walked past. And the fact that it happened in that particular town of all places only sharpens the point. This was not some hostile foreign city. It was home. These were the people who had watched him grow up, who remembered him as a boy, who could probably name his brothers and sisters and point to the little workshop where he had learned a trade. You might expect familiarity to make faith easier. Instead, it made it apparently impossible. They could not get past the fact that they knew him or thought they did, and their refusal to believe was somehow tangled up with what he was and was not able to do among them. The account draws a direct line between their unbelief and his inability, and that connection is its own quiet bombshell. It hints that his power in that moment was not a self-contained engine he could rev whenever he liked, humming along the same in every driveway no matter who was watching. It was something that operated within relationship, something that could be, in a real and unsettling sense, obstructed. And here is a detail about the details that is easy to miss. Nobody forced these moments to stay in the record. The people who wrote these accounts believed passionately that Jesus was worth staking their lives on. They were not neutral observers. If any of this had struck them as embarrassing, as a threat to his dignity or his standing, they had every motive in the world to quietly trim it, to smooth the not knowing into something more majestic, to soften could not into chose not to. They did not, They wrote down that he was tired, that he asked real questions, that he could not work miracles at home, and they wrote it without apology, as if it were simply true and simply fine. That is worth pausing on. The very people most invested in his greatness saw no contradiction between that greatness and a Jesus who ran into real limits. Somewhere down the centuries, we became far more nervous about it than they ever were. So look at what we have assembled: body, space, time, knowledge, power. 5 folders, and watch how they escalate. The first folder, the body, everyone signs off on without a second thought. The second and third, space and time, most people can absorb with a little effort, filing them under the general idea that he had a real human life. But by the time you reach knowledge and power, the room gets tense because those last 2 folders are where the comfortable answers stop working and the guardians of orthodoxy start clearing their throats. A hungry Messiah is charming, a Messiah who does not know the day of his own return, and who could not perform miracles on his home turf is a theological emergency, or at least it has been treated like one. And you can understand the panic even if you suspect it is overblown. The moment you grant that Jesus genuinely did not know something, or genuinely could not do something, a nervous voice at the back of the room starts asking the obvious follow-up. If he did not know the date, what else did he not know? If he could not work miracles in one town, what does that say about the miracles he pulled off everywhere else? Were those his own power, or was something else entirely going on? Give an inch on knowledge and power, the worry goes, and you may have set off down a slope with no clear place to stop, a slope that bottoms out at a Jesus who is impressive but ordinary, a spiritual genius rather than God among us. That fear is not silly. It is the fear that has driven a great deal of the caution over the centuries. And it is a fear we are going to have to answer honestly rather than wave away. That is the case file. 5 folders of clues, dozens of moments, one recurring pattern of a fully divine figure who nevertheless keeps running into edges he ought not to have. And that pattern is not a problem to be nervously buried. It is the evidence. Everything from here on out, every council, every ancient Greek word, every rival theory, and every accusation of heresy is really just an argument about how to read this stack of folders sitting on the table in front of us. The woman by the sea handed us the first clue. Now we have 5 folders full of them. The only question left is what kind of person leaves fingerprints like these? And to answer that, we are going to have to go back a very long way, to a set of arguments that nearly tore the early church apart, long before anyone thought to put the story on the internet. Because the people who first wrestled with these folders did not have the luxury of treating any of it as an abstraction. They were trying to work out who they were actually praying to, and they were prepared to argue about it for 400 years to get the answer right. The fight did not begin in a quiet lecture hall, and it certainly did not begin politely. For the first couple of centuries after Jesus, the people who followed him were mostly too busy being an illegal and occasionally hunted minority to sit around drafting airtight definitions of his nature. They prayed to him, they sang about him, and a fair number of them died for him, but nobody had yet been cornered into writing down, in careful technical language, exactly how one single individual could be both the eternal maker of the stars and the tired, hungry, thirsty man from the last chapter who fell asleep in the back of a boat. It was one of those questions everyone quietly assumed they understood, right up until somebody asked them to explain it out loud, at which point the whole room discovered it did not actually agree with itself nearly as much as it had imagined. And once the arguing started, it did not stop for the better part of 4 centuries. Try to sit with that timescale for a moment because it is genuinely staggering. We are not talking about a heated weekend conference and a firm handshake at the end. We are talking about roughly 400 years of letters, sermons, insults, councils, reversals, exiles, and the occasional near riot, all circling one deceptively simple problem. If Jesus is fully God and Jesus is also fully human, how do you say both of those things at the same time without your sentence quietly falling apart in your hands? Every attempt to nail it down too tightly on one side sent the other side flying loose, a bit like trying to smooth a bubble out of a screen protector and watching it reappear somewhere else. The church would push the divinity down firmly, and the humanity would pop up wrong. It would press the humanity flat, and the divinity would bulge out of shape. What follows is basically the story of 4 famous failed attempts, each one a tempting shortcut that a whole lot of sincere, intelligent people took before the wider church decided, sometimes after decades of shouting that the shortcut led off a cliff, and it is worth killing the mental image of a hushed room of scholars stroking their beards, because that is nothing like what this looked like on the ground. These arguments spilled out of the churches and into the streets, the markets, the public baths, and ordinary daily life. One writer from the period complained, only half joking, that you could not run a single errand in the capital without getting ambushed by theology. Ask the baker how much for a loaf of bread, he grumbled, and instead of a price, you get a lecture on how the Father is greater than the Son. Ask the attendant at the bathhouse whether the water is hot yet, and he informs you, unprompted, that the Son was brought into being out of nothing. The money changer would happily debate you about the begotten and the unbegotten while counting out your coins. This was not a niche academic hobby confined to a few professionals in robes. For a stretch, in some cities, it was the single most popular argument in town, the ancient equivalent of a whole society refusing to talk about anything but one furiously contested subject, except the subject was the deep nature of Christ rather than a sporting final. The first shortcut is the one associated with a clever and popular preacher named Arius, working out of Alexandria in the early 300s. Arius looked at the problem and reached for what felt like the obvious, tidy solution. God, he reasoned, is by definition unbegotten, without beginning, utterly unique. So if the Son was begotten, if there was any sense in which the Father came first and the Son came after, then the Son could not be God in the full sense. He must instead be the very first and greatest thing God ever made, a magnificent creature higher than the angels, the one through whom everything else was created, but still, at the end of the day, a creature. There was, in Arius' memorable and catchy slogan, a time when the Son was not. It was clean, it was logical, it protected the oneness of God, and it had the added bonus of making the math a great deal easier. It also had one small drawback, which is that it quietly demoted Jesus from God to employee of the month. And a lot of Christians who had been worshiping him for generations were not thrilled to be told they had accidentally been praying to a very impressive created being. The backlash was enormous, and it eventually got the attention of the one person in the empire who could make everyone show up in the same building, which was the Emperor Constantine. He was less interested in the fine grain of the theology than in the fact that his newly favored religion was tearing itself in half over it, which is a very emperor way to feel about a doctrinal crisis. So in the year 325, he summoned bishops from across the known world to a town called Nicaea, and there they hammered out the creed that, in various forms, is still recited in churches today. Against Arius, they insisted that the Son was not made but begotten, of the same substance as the Father. And this is where we get one of the greatest linguistic showdowns in all of history, a fight so precise it comes down to a single letter. The word the council chose was homoousios, meaning the same substance. The party sympathetic to Arius could live with homoousios, meaning a similar substance. The entire fate of Christian doctrine, whether Jesus was the same as God or merely rather like God, hung on one little Greek letter, the iota. This, in fact, is where we get the expression that there is not one iota of difference between two things, except that at Nicaea there absolutely was, and it was arguably the most consequential typo debate in human memory. There is even a beloved legend that one bishop got so worked up during the proceedings that he walked over and slapped Arius across the face, which, if true, would make it the most dramatic moment in the history of committee meetings, and which historians gently remind us is probably too good to be entirely factual. And here is a detail that rarely survives into the tidy version of the story. Nicaea did not actually end the fight. If anything, it kicked off the ugliest stretch of it. For the next 50 or 60 years, the argument seesawed back and forth, and for long stretches, the party sympathetic to Arius was quietly winning, backed by a run of emperors who found the Nicene position politically inconvenient. The great champion of the winning creed, a stubborn and utterly immovable figure named Athanasius, spent his entire career paying for that stubbornness, exiled from his own city not once but 5 separate times as the imperial mood swung against him. There is an old phrase that sums up his life, Athanasius against the world, because at more than one grim low point, it genuinely looked as though nearly everyone in power had lined up on the opposite side, and he simply refused to budge an inch. The point worth carrying forward is that none of this was clean or quick or obvious in the moment. The The creed we now rattle off in about 90 seconds took the better part of a lifetime of exile, reversal, and sheer bullheadedness to actually stick, which is a helpful thing to keep in mind the next time someone insists a doctrine was self-evident from day one. So the first shortcut, shrinking the deity down to a creature, was ruled out of bounds. Fence number 1 was up. But the church quickly discovered that once you slam the door on one error, people simply pile up in front of the opposite door. Enter a bishop named Apollinaris, who was actually a firm defender of Nicaea and, ironically, overcorrected himself right into a new problem. Apollinaris was so determined to protect the full divinity of Christ that he came up with a rather surgical solution. A human being, he figured, is basically a human body animated by a human mind or rational soul. So in the case of Jesus, why not keep the human body but swap out the human mind and let the eternal divine word take the place of the human soul? You would get a real flesh and blood body driven directly by God himself. Problem apparently solved. No messy human uncertainty cluttering up the seat behind the wheel. The trouble is that this quietly amputated half of what makes a human being human. A body with no human mind is not a full person. It is a very sophisticated puppet with a divine hand inside it. And the theologians who spotted the flaw made an argument so sharp it has echoed ever since. Their logic ran like this: Jesus came to rescue and heal all of what we are, and whatever part of human nature he did not actually take on, he therefore did not actually heal. If he did not have a genuine human mind, then human minds are left out in the cold, unredeemed, because he never really became one of us where it counts most. What is not assumed is not healed, they said, and it landed like a hammer. So at a council in Constantinople in the year 381, the church condemned this idea too, and doubled down that Jesus was not a divine mind wearing a body like a costume, but a complete human being, mind and soul and all, running on genuinely human hardware. Fence number 2 went up. Do not shrink the humanity either. By now you can probably feel the shape of the trap. Every time the church protects one truth too aggressively, it accidentally tramples the other, and the next generation has to run out and rebuild whatever just got flattened. The third shortcut swings the pendulum yet again. If shrinking either side is off the table, some reasoned, then let us keep both fully intact by keeping them politely separate. This tendency is usually pinned on Nestorius, a bishop of Constantinople, though scholars still argue about how much of the extreme position he personally held versus how much got attached to his name in the heat of battle, which is a very fair thing to worry about when your reputation is being decided by furious opponents. The Nestorian instinct pushed the two natures so far apart that Jesus started to look less like one person and more like two roommates sharing a single body, a divine person and a human person, loosely bolted together, taking turns. The spark that set this one ablaze was, of all things, a title given to Mary. Was she the mother of God, or only the mother of the man Jesus? To the party defending the unity of Christ, led by the formidable and not remotely shy Cyril of Alexandria, calling her merely the mother of the human part gave the whole game away, because it implied there was a human part you could cleanly peel off from the divine part, which is exactly the splitting they feared. In the year 431, a council at Ephesus sided against the Nestorian position, insisting that the one born of Mary was a single unified person, not a pair of tenants who happened to cohabit. Fence number 3. Do not saw Jesus in half into two persons, which leaves the fourth and final shortcut, and by now you can practically predict it, because it is the exact mirror image of the last one. If dividing him into two is forbidden, why not fuse the two natures so completely that they melt into one? This is the idea linked to a monk named Eutyches, and it goes by the imposing label monophysitism, which simply means one nature. On this view, when the divine and the human came together in Jesus, the human nature was so utterly overwhelmed by the divine that it basically dissolved into it. The favorite image his critics used was a single drop of honey falling into the ocean. Technically, the honey is still in there somewhere, but good luck ever tasting it again. So the humanity survives only in theory, swallowed up and effectively erased by an infinite divine sea. And that, of course, sabotages the whole point, because if his humanity got absorbed into vapor, then he never fully shared our condition after all, and we are right back to a Jesus who only looked human from the outside. That brings us at last to the year 451, and the town of Chalcedon, where the church finally produced the statement that has functioned as the master boundary line ever since. Drawing on a hugely influential letter from Pope Leo I, the assembled bishops crafted a definition that did not so much solve the mystery as fence it in on all four sides at once, ruling out every shortcut we just watched fail. Here is the heart of it in plain terms. Jesus is one single person existing in two complete natures, one fully divine and one fully human. And those two natures are joined together in a way described by four careful words that are really four polite refusals. They come together without confusion, meaning the natures do not blur into a smoothie. Without change, meaning neither nature gets altered or downgraded in the process. Without division and without separation, meaning you can never split them back apart into two people or two Jesuses. Fully God, fully human, not blended, not divided, all in one person. That is the whole recipe, and every one of those four phrases is a tombstone marking one of the four failed shortcuts we just walked through. Theologians have a fancy name for this arrangement, the hypostatic union, and it sounds intimidating, but the plain language version is not so bad. The cleanest way to hold it in your head is to separate the question of who from the question of what. There is exactly one who in Jesus, one single personal subject, one center of identity that says the word I and means it. But that one who operates through two whats, two full sets of nature or equipment, one divine and one human. One person, two natures, one who, two whats. When Jesus gets hungry, that is the human what in action. When he does something only God can do, that is the divine what. But there are never two who's taking turns, and the two whats never blend into some third hybrid thing that is neither properly God nor properly human. It is a genuinely elegant solution in the way that a really good knot is elegant, holding two ropes together so firmly that you cannot tell where the tension is coming from. It would be tidy to report that Chalcedon settled everything and the whole church joined hands and moved happily on. It did not. The definition was balanced so finely that it managed to look like a betrayal to people on both edges, and a sizable body of churches, especially in Egypt, Syria, Armenia, and Ethiopia, could not accept the way it spoke of two natures. They worried it leaned too close to the splitting error, and they held instead to their own careful formula about the single united nature of Christ. Those churches never came back into the fold, and remarkably, they are still here today, more than 15 centuries later, as the ancient Oriental churches, a living reminder that even the most celebrated definition in Christian history did not win a unanimous vote. So when we treat Chalcedon as the master boundary line, it deserves a small asterisk. It became the standard for the largest streams of the faith, but it was less a group hug and more a treaty that some parties quietly refused to sign, which, if anything, only underlines how genuinely hard this puzzle is. The finest minds of the age, given 4 centuries and every incentive to agree, still could not all fit the same words around it. It is also fair to wonder why anyone would burn 400 years and several careers in exile splitting these particular hairs. Was it just intellectual vanity, a lot of clever men who enjoyed winning arguments? Sometimes, honestly, probably a little. But underneath the ego and the politics sat a deadly serious concern, and it was about rescue. The logic ran like this: if Jesus was not truly and fully God, then he had no power to actually save anyone, since only God can bridge the gap between God and us. But if he was not truly and fully human, then there was nothing of ours for him to rescue in the first place, because he never really stepped into our shoes. Salvation, on this reasoning, needed a bridge that touched both banks of the river at once, fully anchored in the divine on one side and fully anchored in the human on the other. Shave off either end, and the bridge no longer reaches. So every failed shortcut was not merely a philosophical slip to these people. Each one was, in their eyes, a quiet way of sawing through one end of the only bridge that could carry anyone across. That is why they fought as though the stakes were infinite. In their minds, they were. Now, why does any of this ancient drama matter for a theory going viral on the internet a millennium and a half later? Because those 4 fences are the rules of the game, and they are the reason this whole conversation is so delicate. Anybody who wants to offer a fresh account of how Jesus lived, healed, and did not know the day of his return has to somehow do it while staying inside all 4 fences at once. You are not allowed to shrink his deity down to something less than fully God. You are not allowed to shrink his humanity down to something less than fully human. You're not allowed to melt the two natures into one blurred thing. And you're not allowed to split him into two separate people. Solve the puzzle of the limitation verses, sure, but you have to do it in a box with 4 walls and no exits. And if your clever solution knocks out even one of those walls, roughly 2,000 years of consensus will politely but firmly show you the door. And this is exactly where our viral theory walks onto the stage, hands raised, promising it can do the impossible. The idea of kenosis, which we will unpack properly very soon, presents itself as a modern attempt to honor all 4 fences while finally making sense of that stack of folders from earlier, the hunger and the not knowing and the power that ran low. Its supporters say it keeps Jesus fully God and fully human, undivided and unblended, while explaining at last why he lived with such real human limits. It sounds on paper like exactly the tightrope act the whole tradition has been begging for, but you can already hear the critics warming up in the back row, and their accusation is going to be pointed. They will argue that the theory only pretends to respect the fences, and that when you look closely, a Jesus, who empties himself of his divine powers, has quietly climbed over fence number 1, the very first wall the church built, the one that keeps his deity fully intact. In other words, they will claim kenosis is just the old Aryan shortcut wearing a fresh coat of paint and a modern haircut. Whether that charge sticks is the drama of the chapters ahead. But at least now, armed with the 4 fences and the failed shortcuts that raised them, you are equipped to judge the theory the same way the church has judged every idea about Jesus for the last 1,600 years, rather than simply because a video told you it sounded cool. And here's the twist that makes the whole modern argument even sharper. For all the councils and creeds and centuries of careful fence building, the entire viral theory ultimately hangs on a single word, buried in a short passage in one of the letters Paul wrote, a passage that may well be older than the letter it sits inside. Everything, the whole case for and against, comes down to what that one word actually means. So before we can put the theory on trial, we have to go stand very close to the word itself and stare at it until it starts giving up its secrets. The passage lives in the letter to the Philippians in the 2nd chapter, and it is short enough that you could miss its weight on a casual read. Paul is, of all things, giving practical advice about humility. He wants his readers to stop jockeying for status and to start putting each other first. And to make the point, he reaches for the ultimate example, the mindset of Christ himself. And then he says something remarkable. Christ, he writes, existing in the very form of God, did not treat equality with God as something to be clutched and hoarded and exploited for his own advantage. Instead, he emptied himself, taking the form of a servant, being born in human likeness. Then he humbled himself further still, all the way down to death. It is a description of a staggering downward journey, a voluntary descent from the highest possible position into the lowest. And it is the single most important thing the New Testament ever says about how Jesus set his divinity aside, or did not, depending on who you ask. Before we zoom in on the crucial word, it is worth appreciating just how old and precious this little text is. Most scholars suspect that Paul did not compose these lines himself on the spot. The passage has a noticeably different rhythm from the prose around it, a lift and cadence that reads almost like song lyrics dropped into the middle of an ordinary letter. The way you might quote a well-known verse mid-conversation and everybody in the room instantly recognizes it. The strong suspicion is that Paul is quoting an even earlier hymn, something the first Christians were already singing before Paul ever sat down to write. Scholars have nicknamed it the Carmen Christi, the Song of Christ. If they are right, then this is one of the very oldest windows we have into how the earliest followers understood who Jesus was. A snapshot of their faith taken before the councils, before most of the New Testament even existed, before anyone had drawn a single one of the 4 fences. These may be, quite literally, the first theological words ever set to music about him, which makes it a little wild that the entire modern debate now rests on how to translate one of its verbs. There is something quietly astonishing tucked into that fact, and it is easy to speed straight past. If this really is an early hymn that Paul inherited rather than composed himself, then within just a couple of decades of the crucifixion, ordinary believers were already gathering and singing that Jesus existed in the form of God and deserved the worship of all creation. That is not the slow, cautious legend that skeptics sometimes picture, a humble teacher gradually inflated into a deity over long centuries of myth-making. This is a full-throated confession of his divine status showing up almost immediately, in song, in the very first generation, among people who could still have shaken hands with eyewitnesses. Whatever you make of the claim itself, the timing is remarkable. The highest possible view of Jesus is not a late addition bolted on by later councils. It is sitting right there in what may be the oldest Christian lyric we possess, which makes the fight over one of its verbs feel less like nitpicking a dusty document and more like eavesdropping on the very first thing the church ever tried to say out loud about who he was. The shape of the song is worth tracing too, because it is not only a plunge downward. The hymn moves like a great letter V drawn in the air. The first half is all descent, step after step of self-lowering, from the height of divine glory, down into human form, down further into the role of a servant, down all the way to death, and specifically the most degrading form of execution the ancient world had on offer. Every line drops lower than the one before it. And then, at the very bottom of the V, everything reverses. The second half turns sharply upward. Because of that descent, the song declares, God lifted him to the highest place and gave him a name above every name, so that in the end all creation would bow and acknowledge him. Down and then up, humiliation and then exaltation. This matters for our question because the emptying, whatever it turns out to be, sits right at the top of that downward slope, framed as the opening move of a voluntary descent. Whatever he poured it out on the way down, and whatever it was, the song insists he received it all back and more on the way up. That framing does not decide the debate, but it certainly colors it because it presents the emptying not as a permanent loss, but as a temporary, chosen, downward leg of a round trip. That verb is the one hiding inside the phrase, he emptied himself. In the original Greek, it is hauton ekenosin, and the key part is that verb ekenosin from the root kenu. And now you can probably feel the ground shift under your feet, because kenu is the exact word that gives us kenosis, to empty, to pour out, to make void or vacant. The entire theory, the one blowing up online, the one theologians branded a heresy for a century and a half, takes its name straight from this one syllable in this one ancient song. He emptied himself. Kenosis is simply the noun for the emptying. So when people debate whether the kenosis theory is true, what they are really debating, whether they know it or not, is what Paul or that early hymn meant by this single, loaded, gorgeously ambiguous word. And this verb is not even the only loaded term in the passage begging to be unpacked. Look at the bookends on either side of the emptying. Just before it, Christ is described as existing in the form of God, and just after it, as taking the form of a servant. That word form is doing enormous quiet work because in the original, it does not mean a mere outward appearance, a costume or a mask, but something much closer to the genuine nature and inner reality that a thing truly possesses. So the passage is not saying he merely looked godlike and then looked servant-like. It is saying he truly was, in the deepest reality, God, and then genuinely took on the deepest reality of a servant. There is also that striking little phrase about equality with God being something he refused to treat as a prize to be seized and clutched. Scholars argue without end over whether that means he declined to grab at something he did not yet have, or declined to cling white-knuckled to something he already fully possessed. The second reading is by far the more common one, and it paints a gorgeous picture, a being who held every right to the throne and simply chose not to exploit it, who was dealt all the divine cards and refused to play a single one for his own advantage. Hold that image close because it is going to matter a great deal when we finally meet the gentlest and most defensible version of the theory. Before we split into the two readings, there is one more clue in the language that serious readers cannot politely ignore, and it happens to lean fairly hard in one direction. The same author who hands us this line uses that very verb, kenu, a handful of other times across his letters, and in every single one of those other cases he uses it as a figure of speech, never as the literal draining of some physical substance. He speaks of a promise being emptied of its force, of the message of the cross being emptied of its power if you preach it the wrong way, of a proud boast being emptied of all meaning. In none of those does anyone literally pour anything out of anything. Each time, emptied means rendered void, drained of significance, reduced to nothing that counts. So when the same writer reaches for the same word to describe what Christ did, there is a genuinely strong case that he means it exactly the way he always means it. That Christ made himself nothing, reduced himself to zero status, rather than that he surgically extracted a checklist of divine attributes. That is a real and serious point, and an honest defender of the viral theory has to wrestle with it rather than pretend it is not sitting there. It does not end the argument on its own, but it is precisely the kind of evidence that has kept the traditional reading in the lead for most of church history. And here is where the fork in the road appears, the fork that this entire series has been walking toward. There are two very different ways to read "He emptied himself," and they lead to two completely different Jesuses. The first way is the radical, literal reading. On this view, emptied means exactly what it sounds like. He actually poured something out. He genuinely sat down, gave up, or laid aside some portion of what it means to be God, at least for the duration of his human life. He walked into the world with the tank deliberately drained, which would explain, rather neatly, every one of those folders we assembled. The not knowing, the tiredness, the power that ran low under the touch of one woman in a crowd. On this reading, the word is not decoration, it is a literal report of a literal emptying, and it is the beating heart of the viral theory. The second way is the traditional metaphorical reading, and it is the one most of church history has preferred, precisely because it keeps all four fences standing. On this view, emptied himself is a figure of speech, the same kind we use all the time. When we say a coach poured himself out for his team, or that a mother made herself nothing for her children, we do not mean they literally deleted parts of themselves from existence. We mean they set aside their own status, comfort, and rights in an act of self-giving love. Read this way: Christ did not empty himself of his divine nature or attributes at all. He emptied himself of his rank and privilege and glory, the way a king might set aside his crown and robes to work quietly among his people while remaining, the entire time, fully the king. He gave up his rights, not his deity. He kept everything that made him God and simply refused to cash it in. Notice something clever and frustrating about the grammar here, because it is the reason smart people have argued about this for so long without a knockout blow. The sentence tells us very clearly what Jesus emptied himself into. He emptied himself by taking the form of a servant. That part is spelled out. What the sentence pointedly does not do is hand us a tidy list of what, specifically, got poured out in the process. It gives us the direction of the descent, the shape of the humility, the destination, servanthood, but it stays silent on the exact contents of the container that was emptied. Was it his divine powers, his independent use of them, merely his glory and honor? The text simply does not stop to itemize the receipt. And into that silence, 2,000 years of theologians have poured 2,000 years of arguments. So this really is the linguistic hinge on which the whole enormous door swings. If the literal reading is correct, then the viral theory has a genuine foothold planted right in the oldest layer of Christian song, and everything from here becomes a matter of working out the details of how the emptying operated. But if the metaphorical reading is correct, then the single strongest proof text for the entire theory quietly evaporates into a beautiful poem about humility. And the kenosis camp is left having to make its case from the scattered folders alone without its flagship verse. One little verb, and the whole thing tips one way or the other. There is no third option waiting in the wings to rescue us from the choice. You look at "He emptied himself," and you decide whether that is a factual report of a divine, self-limiting, or a soaring metaphor for self-giving love. And whichever way you lean, an entire understanding of who Jesus was quietly assembles itself behind your decision. And to really feel how much rides on this fork, just watch what each reading does to one single miracle, say the calming of that storm on the lake we mentioned earlier. On the literal reading, when Jesus stands up in the pitching boat and the wind instantly dies, he is not reaching into his own bottomless divine power because he set that aside at the door on the way in. He is doing it some other way, on borrowed strength, which immediately throws open an enormous question about where exactly that strength was coming from, a question we're going to chase down hard in the chapters ahead. But on the metaphorical reading, the flattened sea is simply God doing what only God can do, his own untouched divine power flexing quietly through a servant who never surrendered it in the first place. Same storm, same command, same sudden calm, and yet two utterly different accounts of what is really happening beneath the surface. That is how much freight one tiny verb is hauling. Choose the literal reading, and every miracle becomes a mystery about borrowed power. Choose the metaphorical reading, and every miracle is just the hidden king briefly showing his hand. You cannot quietly split the difference. You have to pick, and your pick rewrites the meaning of everything he ever did. The good news, if you find this maddening, is that you now hold the actual tool the experts use. You can see both readings sitting right there in the same phrase. You can feel how the literal reading tugs toward the case file we already built, and how the metaphorical reading tugs toward the four fences we just inspected, and how genuinely, honestly hard it is to declare a clean winner from the word alone. That tension is not a flaw in your understanding. It is the exact place where the whole debate actually lives. And with the word itself now in your hands and the fences fresh in your mind, we are finally ready to stop circling and start meeting the rival theories head on, one at a time, each one making its best possible case for what really happened when the maker of the stars decided to get hungry, get tired, and ask a crowd who on earth had just touched him. We begin with the theory that plays the most defense, the one that guards the divinity of Christ like a bodyguard who never once takes his eyes off the exits. Call it the hidden God view, and if you grew up in almost any mainstream church, this is very likely the answer you absorbed without anyone ever bothering to give it a name. It is the natural home of the metaphorical reading we inspected a moment ago, the one that treats the great emptying as a setting aside of glory rather than any draining of power. And its central claim is bracingly simple. Jesus never gave up a thing. Not one divine attribute, not a single ounce of unlimited knowledge, not 1 watt of unlimited power, not a moment of being everywhere at once. He kept the entire divine toolkit fully charged the whole time. He simply chose, for the length of his earthly life, to keep the toolkit mostly out of sight. On this reading, the divine power was always there, humming quietly under the surface like a high-performance engine idling at a red light. And every so often the veil would slip and a flash of it would show through. And the supporters of this view have a genuinely impressive list of moments where exactly that seems to happen. Take the scene where some religious scholars are sitting there silently judging him, not saying a word out loud, just thinking their disapproving thoughts, and Jesus answers the objection they never voiced, because he apparently heard it anyway. He reads the room in the most literal sense possible, responding to thoughts that never made it into speech. Or take his very first meeting with a man named Nathaniel, whom he greets by essentially saying he had already watched him sitting under a fig tree before anyone had introduced them, before Nathaniel was even on the guest list, which understandably leaves the man rattled. He predicts things that have not happened yet, calling in advance that one of his closest followers will deny even knowing him before the rooster crows, describing the manner of his own death, forecasting the eventual ruin of the great temple itself. And in one of the tensest moments of his life, arrested in a garden at night, he mentions almost offhandedly that if he wanted to, he could call down more than 12 legions of angels to end the whole affair on the spot. He does not, but the point lands. The power is on the table. He is just declining to reach for it. So on the hidden God view, all of this fits together into a tidy and rather comforting picture. The knowledge was never missing. The power was never gone. And that means every one of those awkward questions we filed away earlier, the who touched me, the how many loaves, the how long has this boy been suffering, has to be reinterpreted. If he already knew every answer, then the questions were never actually questions. They were technique, they were pedagogy, teaching moves, the ancient equivalent of a professor who asked the class something he could answer in his sleep, purely to get the students to think it through for themselves. On this reading, Jesus is the ultimate master teacher running a flawless version of the method where you lead people to the truth by asking, drawing out a public confession of faith from a frightened woman, giving his followers a chance to admit they only have 5 loaves, so the miracle that follows lands harder. Every apparent gap in his knowledge becomes a deliberate, strategic pause, a rhetorical device delivered with a perfectly straight face by someone who already holds the answer card. And this instinct, it turns out, is not some recent invention cooked up to dodge the hard verses. It has a long and respectable pedigree. A few centuries back, Lutheran theologians got into a rather intense internal argument over precisely this question, and one camp landed almost exactly here. Their position is sometimes labeled crypsis, from the Greek word for hiding or concealment, the same root that gives us words like cryptic and encryption. The Crypsis school held that the human Jesus possessed the full range of divine powers at every moment, but kept them secret, using them quietly, hiddenly behind the curtain, never putting them on open display. On this account, he was, in effect, running the divine software the entire time, just with the screen brightness turned all the way down so nobody could see it glowing. It is a serious, historically grounded position with real theological muscle behind it, and it deserves to be taken seriously rather than waved off. It is also worth noting that the hidden God view comes in a range of strengths rather than a single flavor. The harder version imagines Jesus running the full divine apparatus in secret, more or less constantly, quietly, all-knowing behind a human face at every waking moment. The softer version says the powers were fully retained but only occasionally drawn upon, surfacing now and then rather than humming non-stop. The softer version is the more modest and the more careful of the two, and it dodges some of the sharper objections. But even the gentle version still has to settle the same bill at the end of the night, because whether the concealed power was tapped constantly or only rarely, the mere fact that it sat there available on demand is enough to raise the awkward question we are about to reach. Here is what the hidden God view gets gloriously right, and it is worth saying plainly before we start poking at it. This theory is a fortress around the divinity of Christ. It never, not for one instant, lets you wonder whether he was really God. It keeps every attribute intact, which means it sails cleanly past the first and most jealously guarded of those four fences, the one that forbids shrinking the deity down into something less. It reads the great emptying as a matter of laying aside glory and status rather than surrendering any actual power, which is exactly the reading most of church history has preferred. It is safe, it is orthodox, it has centuries of serious defenders. If your single overriding priority is to protect the truth that Jesus is fully and completely God, this view does that job with the ruthless efficiency of a very good insurance policy. It is worth being honest about why this view is so beloved in the pews, because the appeal is not only logical, it is deeply emotional. There is enormous comfort in a Savior who was never once caught off guard, never confused, never genuinely in the dark or genuinely at risk, always in total command of every situation from the inside. The preacher who assures the congregation that Jesus knew precisely what he was doing at every single moment is offering real reassurance, and reassurance is not a small thing. Nobody particularly wants to imagine their God fumbling. The difficulty is that reassurance, left unchecked, can slowly become the quiet enemy of honesty, smoothing over the very details the text went out of its way to record. And it is right along that seam that the first cracks begin to show. But every fortress has a price, and the price of this one is paid in a single precious currency, authenticity. Because if Jesus knew every outcome in advance, with total divine certainty, then a quiet and uncomfortable question starts to creep in. Did any of it actually cost him anything? Think back to that long stretch in the wilderness without food. A fast is genuinely brutal when you do not know how it ends, when hunger is gnawing and there is real doubt about whether you can hold out. But if you know, with the unshakable certainty of God, that you will come through it perfectly fine, is it really the same fast that you or I would white-knuckle through? Or think of him asleep in the back of the boat during that terrifying storm, a scene we met earlier. It is one thing to sleep soundly through a squall because you are a normal, exhausted human trusting for the best. It is quite another to sleep soundly because you happen to know, as a matter of divine fact, that the boat cannot possibly sink and that you could flatten the waves with a single word the moment you felt like it. That is not courage in the storm. That is a nap with a safety net the size of the universe. And when you follow that thread all the way to the end, it leads somewhere genuinely awkward. If he faced every hardship already knowing the ending, already having read the last page, then he was, to put it bluntly, playing life on the easy setting. The difficulty slider quietly dialed down to peaceful, the cheat codes entered before the level even loaded. His bravery, his endurance, his willingness to keep going, all of it starts to feel less like the struggle of a real participant and more like the confident stroll of someone who has already seen the walkthrough. And that turns him, slowly and against the best intentions of everyone involved, into something troubling. not a fellow traveler who actually shared our condition, but a performer delivering an extremely convincing impersonation of one, a stunt double who takes the fall, knowing full well he is secretly indestructible. This is not a minor aesthetic complaint. It runs headfirst into one of the most important claims the New Testament makes about him. There is a line in the letter to the Hebrews that insists he was tested and tempted in every way that we are, yet without giving in. Sit with how strong that claim is, tempted in every way as we are. But temptation only really means something if the outcome is genuinely open, if there is an actual possibility of being overwhelmed. Temptation with a guaranteed result, temptation you already know from the inside cannot possibly succeed against you, is a strange and hollow sort of temptation. It is like being dared to fall off a wall while wearing an invisible harness bolted to the sky. If the hidden God view is right, and he was fully aware the entire time that no trial could ever actually break him, then it becomes very hard to say he was tempted the way we are, and the beautiful, difficult claim of that verse starts to quietly deflate. The single hardest piece of homework this view has to hand in is that blunt little line where Jesus flatly states that nobody knows the day of his return, not the angels and not even the Son. You cannot easily reframe that one as a clever teaching device because he is not asking anybody anything and he is not drawing out a lesson. He is plainly reporting about himself that he does not possess a particular piece of information. So the defenders of the hidden view reach for a tool borrowed straight from the councils we walk through, the two natures. They argue that he did know the day according to his divine nature, but did not know it according to his human nature, and that in this moment he was simply speaking out of the human side. It is a genuinely ingenious move, and it is not obviously wrong. But notice the quiet cost. It means that at any given moment you now have to work out which nature is doing the talking, and it allows the very same person to both know and not know the exact same fact at the exact same time. Depending on how generous you are feeling, that is either a profound and holy mystery, or an extremely convenient way to have the answer come out however you happen to need it. So this is where we have to be scrupulously fair, because the hidden God view is no straw man, and treating it like one would be both lazy and false. It is a powerful, deeply rooted, fiercely protective theory held by brilliant people, resting on real texts where the divine power visibly breaks through the surface. It absolutely succeeds at its main goal, which is to keep the deity of Christ beyond all doubt. Its weakness is not stupidity. Its weakness is a kind of overprotectiveness, a tendency to guard the divinity so completely that the humanity quietly thins out into performance. It secures the who at a slow, creeping cost to the how. And with that cost noted, but the theory still standing and respected, we move on to the contender that tries to fix exactly this problem by meeting somewhere in the middle. If the first theory protects the deity so hard that the humanity starts to feel like an act, the obvious next move is compromise. Split the difference. Do not keep everything and do not give up everything, just find some sensible line in between and settle there. This is the instinct behind the second major view, which we can call the partial view, and it presents itself as the reasonable, level-headed grown-up in the room, the one that refuses to get dragged to either extreme. Its thesis goes like this: when the Son became human, he genuinely did set some divine attributes aside, and he really did keep others. The most obvious casualty is being everywhere at once because, as we saw when we sorted the folders, he is plainly stuck in one location at a time, walking dusty roads at ordinary walking speed, arriving places late, unable to be in two towns simultaneously. So the partial view happily concedes that particular attribute. He gave up being omnipresent the moment he was born into a single body in a single spot. But, the theory continues, he clearly held on to others, and crucially, he held on to a real, working, personal supply of miraculous power. Enough of it to heal the sick and even raise the dead on his own authority. Some divine features stayed home, some came along for the ride, and the healing power was very much along for the ride. Here is a quiet little secret about this middle view. It is, in practice, the position most ordinary believers already hold, without ever having stuck a label on it. Ask an average churchgoer whether the infant Jesus was simultaneously everywhere in the universe while lying in the manger, and most will say no, of course not, he was in the manger. Ask them whether the grown Jesus could heal the sick, and they will say yes, obviously. And with those two casual answers, they have just sketched the partial view in miniature, Some divine features switched off, others left running, without the faintest idea that they were taking a side in a centuries-old debate. It is less a carefully reasoned doctrine than a comfortable default, the spot your intuition naturally settles into when you have not yet examined the question too closely. You can see why this is attractive. It feels balanced in a way the first view does not. It takes the limitation folders seriously instead of explaining them away, because it admits he really was bounded, really was local, really did operate within genuine limits. And at the same time, it takes the miracles completely at face value, no reinterpretation required, because of course he could heal. He still had the power on board. It does not force you to accuse him of faking his exhaustion, and it does not force you to twist the healings into something other than what they look like. It is the theory of moderation, and moderation is usually a safe bet, usually. The trouble arrives the instant you ask the one question the partial view cannot comfortably answer. Where precisely is the line? If he kept enough power, then how much is enough, and which attributes made the final cut, and which got left behind, and on what principle? The theory is remarkably quiet on all of this. It draws a line, yes, but it draws it in disappearing ink, and when you lean in to read exactly where it falls, the mark has already faded. And that vagueness stops being a mere technicality the moment you look closely at the actual pattern of the miracles, because the pattern turns out to be deeply, stubbornly strange. The theory ends up working a little like putting a phone into low-power mode. Some functions keep running, others get switched off to preserve the battery, which is a perfectly sensible thing for a phone to do. The problem is which functions and who set the switches. A phone in low-power mode still rings when someone calls, but it dims its screen and freezes the apps running in the background. The partial view is essentially claiming that Jesus shipped into the world in low-power mode, with omnipresence toggled off but healing left switched on. What it never once hands you is the settings menu. It cannot tell you why healing stayed on while presence got disabled, or why the switches landed exactly where they did rather than in some completely different configuration. The battery saving is simply asserted. The logic behind the particular settings is nowhere to be found. Start with a scene at a certain pool, a place people believed had healing properties, where crowds of the sick and disabled would gather and wait, hoping for their moment. When Jesus arrives, the place is full of suffering people, a whole colonnade of them lying there. And he heals exactly one. He picks out a single man who had been unwell for decades, restores him, and then slips away. One. Now, if Jesus was carrying around a personal reservoir of healing power with the tap fully functional, and if his compassion was as boundless as everything else about him suggests, then why on earth would he heal one man and leave a courtyard full of others exactly as he found them? A being with a working supply and limitless mercy who chooses to heal one out of many is not self-explanatory. It cries out for a reason, and the flat statement that he kept part of the power supplies precisely none. The strangeness only deepens when you zoom out to the map. In some places, the accounts tell us he healed every disease and every sickness among the people. Whole crowds streaming to him, nobody sent away disappointed, the power apparently on full blast. And yet, in his own hometown, as we noted when we built the case file, he did almost nothing, and the text goes so far as to say he could not perform mighty works there, not that he chose not to. So if the power is his own private retained supply, a battery he brought along in his chest, why does it run at full output in one town and sputter to almost nothing in another? A personal battery does not particularly care which town it is in. It should work the same everywhere you carry it. The geography should be irrelevant. But it is not irrelevant, not even slightly, and the partial view has nothing to say about why. And then there is the sharpest case of all, one that becomes available to us only after Jesus is gone, and it is genuinely uncomfortable. There was a man, lame from birth, who was carried every single day to one of the main gates of the temple, where he sat and begged, every day for years, the same spot, the same gate. Then one afternoon, after Jesus has died and risen and departed, 2 of his followers come walking up to that gate, and one of them, a fisherman named Peter, stops in front of the beggar and heals him instantly and completely, restoring legs that had never once worked, and he does it explicitly and openly in the name of Jesus. Now do the uncomfortable arithmetic. That gate was one of the busiest entrances to the temple, and Jesus visited the temple many times over the course of his life. It strains belief to imagine that in all those visits, he never once passed that gate, never once stepped near that man who sat there day after day after day. By any reasonable reckoning, Jesus almost certainly walked right past that beggar, possibly on many occasions, and as far as anything we are told, did nothing. The healing waited. It waited until after he was gone, and then it was performed by one of his followers in his name, using his authority. So here's the knot the partial view cannot untie. Peter did, in the name of Jesus, the very thing that Jesus himself, standing there with his own supposedly retained divine power, apparently did not do. If Jesus had the power on board and the compassion to match, why leave the man sitting there for years, only for a fisherman to heal him later on his behalf? On a theory where Jesus is simply carrying around his own working stash of miracle power, that sequence of events makes very little sense. There is something quietly heartbreaking in that image for anyone who takes the story seriously. The picture of a man carried to the same spot day after day for years, and the one person in all of history most able to help him walking right past. The hidden God view can at least say he had his reasons and knew them all along. The partial view cannot even manage that because it never told us what governs when the power switches on in the first place. And this is the moment the partial view quietly collapses, not because it is silly, but because it turns out not to explain anything. Saying he kept part of the power tells you only that miracles were possible. It gives you no rule whatsoever for when they happen, or where, or how much, or for whom, or why one and not the 100 lying beside him, or why full power here and almost none back home, or why the beggar at the gate had to wait for Peter. It does not predict a single one of these patterns. All it really accomplishes is to pick up the mystery and slide it one seat down the bench. We started by asking how he could do miracles at all, and the partial view answers that sort of, but only by handing us a much harder question in exchange, which is why this bizarre, selective, geographically patchy, oddly delayed pattern of miracles and not some other. It relocates the puzzle. It does not solve it. And beneath the practical mess, there lurks a deeper problem, one that reaches all the way back to the councils. Recall the first and most jealously guarded of those 4 fences, the one that forbids any shrinking of the deity. The partial view says Jesus genuinely gave up some divine attributes, actually surrendered them and left them behind at the door. But that raises a genuinely thorny question. Are the attributes of God optional add-ons that can be unclipped one at a time, like removable trim on a car, or are they simply what God is? If being present everywhere is not a detachable accessory but part of the very definition of what it means to be God at all, then a being who truly lost it did not merely misplace a feature, he stopped being fully God in that respect. Which means the partial view may quietly trip over the very same first fence that critics are waiting to accuse the kenosis theory of knocking down. We will come back to whether the powers of God can be cleanly peeled away from the nature of God, because it turns out to be one of the deepest and most stubborn questions in this entire affair, which is exactly why we need something better. Not a theory that merely establishes that miracles were possible, but one that can actually account for the pattern, that can explain why these and not those, why here and not there, why one man at the pool and a whole crowd elsewhere, why the beggar waited. Keep that specific need burning in the back of your mind because it is the test that the real theory is going to have to pass. A good explanation should not just permit the evidence, it should predict it. And so far, neither of our first 2 contenders has managed that. Which brings us finally to the theory this whole investigation has been circling from the very first scene, the one the church spent a century and a half calling a heresy before the internet decided to give it a second hearing. Here it is, stated as carefully as it deserves. Kenosis, taking its name from that ancient verb we dug into earlier, the one meaning to empty or pour out, proposes something subtle that neither of the first 2 views quite manages. It says that when the Son took on humanity, he did not lose, destroy, or discard any part of his divine identity. He remained every moment of his earthly life fully and completely God in terms of who he was. What he set aside was not his deity and not his attributes as such, but the independent exercise of them, the self-directed, self-initiated use of his own divine powers, the unlimited knowing, the unlimited doing, the being everywhere at once. He kept the identity and he suspended the solo operation of the equipment. 100% God in who he is, and a genuine, unassisted human being in how he lives. Notice how sharply this cuts against both of the theories we just examined, because the difference is not a matter of degree, it is a matter of kind. The hidden God view said he kept every power and simply concealed it, ran the whole divine apparatus in secret behind a curtain. The partial view said he threw some attributes overboard and kept a private stash of the rest to draw on. Kenosis says something different from either. It says he kept absolutely everything, discarded nothing, threw nothing overboard, and also drew on none of it under his own steam. Nothing is destroyed, as the partial view would have it, and nothing is secretly running in the background, as the hidden view would have it. The attributes are all still fully his. He has simply, voluntarily stopped reaching for them on his own initiative. Picture, if it helps, a king who owns a vault stuffed with every treasure in the realm, who has not sold a single coin of it and has not smuggled any into his pockets either, but who has made a deliberate choice to walk among his people living only on what he is handed day by day, leaving the vault door shut the entire time. The treasure is undeniably his. He just will not open the door himself. The distinction the theory leans on is the plain difference between having a capacity and actually using it, and it is something we all grasp instinctively. Picture someone perfectly fluent in 2 languages who walks into a room and chooses to speak only one of them the whole evening. They have not lost the second language. Every word of it is still theirs, fully intact, instantly available the moment they want it. They are simply, deliberately not reaching for it right now. Nobody watching would say that person is only half fluent, or that they abandoned a language at the door. They kept the entire capacity and withheld the exercise. Kenosis says the divine powers are exactly like that unused second language, wholly retained, unquestionably his, and voluntarily left unspoken for the length of a human life. The ability never went anywhere. The choice was simply not to draw on it alone. And the instant you adopt this frame, watch what happens to that whole stack of folders we assembled, because they stop being embarrassing footnotes to be nervously managed and start being exactly what you would expect. The questions become real questions. When he asks who touched him, or how many loaves are on hand, or how long a suffering boy has been afflicted, he is not running a lesson plan or setting up a teachable moment. He genuinely, in the reality of his human experience, does not have that particular fact loaded, so he does the completely natural thing and asks precisely the way any of us would. The strange failure in his hometown becomes an honest could not rather than a diplomatic would not, because the power to override the situation was not something he was drawing on. The line about him growing in wisdom becomes a description of real, actual learning, a mind that truly developed over time, because it was not quietly holding the sum of all knowledge in a hidden reserve the whole while. The hunger, the thirst, the bone-deep exhaustion, the sleep in the storm, all of it becomes genuine and unfaked and costly, because there was no cheat sitting behind any of it. And that is the single greatest thing this theory buys. The prize the hidden God view simply could not deliver. Authenticity. Full, unqualified, no asterisk authenticity. On the canonic reading, Jesus lives a completely genuine human life, with no strategy guide open on the table, no cheat codes entered, no difficulty slider quietly set to peaceful, no invincible stunt double standing in for the hard parts. He meets uncertainty as actual uncertainty, fear as actual fear, and temptation as actual temptation, with a real and open outcome, which means at last that the fierce claim in Hebrews can be taken at full strength. He was tempted in every way as we are, and it can mean exactly that, because for him, as for us, the trial was real and the result was not preloaded. He is not performing our humanity from behind a screen. He is living it out in the open without a net. You can watch this authenticity surface in small moments that are easy to skate past. The accounts describe Jesus more than once being genuinely amazed, marveling at the unexpected trust of a foreign soldier, astonished at the stubborn unbelief of his own neighbors. Amazement is a curious thing to pin on a being who supposedly foresees everything, because you cannot be surprised by what you already fully expected. On the hidden God view, that amazement has to be one more piece of gentle theater. On the canonic view, it is simply real. He was actually surprised because in his human experience he did not have every reaction preloaded, and something genuinely caught him off guard, the way wonderful and terrible things catch any of us off guard. It is a tiny detail, And it is exactly the kind of tiny detail that quietly tips the scale toward the more human reading. It is worth pausing to note that this is also the theory trying hardest to keep all four of those Chalcedonian fences standing at once. It claims to preserve the full deity, since every attribute is retained and nothing is shrunk away. It claims to preserve the full humanity, since the limits and the experience are entirely real. And it claims to do this without blending the two natures into a hybrid or splitting the one person into two. That is the pitch, anyway. And you may recall that the critics from a couple of chapters back are still sitting in the back row, arms folded, ready to argue that this elegant-sounding move actually knocks over the very first fence, that a Jesus who sets aside the use of his powers has quietly slipped into a dressed-up version of the old shrink-the-deity error. That confrontation is coming, and we are not going to dodge it. It is worth naming plainly that kenosis is the boldest and riskiest of the three, precisely because it takes the great emptying most literally. The hidden view and the partial view both keep one foot planted firmly on safer ground. Kenosis plants its whole flag in the most daring reading of that ancient song, the one that says the emptying was a real setting aside rather than a poetic turn of phrase about humility. That is what makes it thrilling, and it is also exactly what makes it dangerous, because the more literally you take the emptying, the closer you drift toward the edge of that first fence, and the louder the accusation of heresy grows. High reward, high risk, which is only fitting for the theory the Church spent a century and a half refusing to touch. But before any of that, there is a far more obvious objection, and if you have been paying attention, you formulated it several paragraphs ago and have been impatiently waiting for me to notice. It is this: hold on just a second. If Jesus genuinely set aside the independent use of his divine power, if he really was living as an unassisted human being drawing on none of his own omnipotence, then how in the world did he do the miracles? Because he unmistakably did do them. He healed the sick, he restored sight, he raised the dead, he stood up in that storm and told the wind and the water to knock it off, and they did. Those things happened, and if the power behind them was not his own divine strength, flexed under his own initiative, then whose power was it, and where on earth was it coming from? That is the elephant in the room, and it is a completely fair, genuinely sharp, entirely reasonable question. In fact, it is the question on which this whole theory lives or dies. A view that explains the hunger and the not knowing beautifully but cannot account for the water turning to wine is a view with a hole in the hull, and everyone can see it. So I'm not going to paper over it or rush past it. I am going to do the opposite. I am going to leave it standing right here in the middle of the room, in full view, unanswered for now, because the answer is the single most original and, honestly, the most satisfying move this entire theory makes, and it deserves its own moment rather than a hurried footnote. It reframes those long nights Jesus spent slipping away alone to pray. It reframes that strange sensation of power leaving him at the touch of one desperate woman in a crowd. It reframes the whole engine of the miracles, top to bottom. And once you see it, a great many things that never quite fit before suddenly click into place with an almost audible snap. So let this be the turning point, and know that it is one. Everything up to now has been the setup, the slow gathering of the pieces, the first strange clue by the sea, the 5 folders of limits, the 400 years of councils, the one loaded word in the oldest Christian song, and the 2 rival theories that each got something right and something badly wrong. From this point forward, the theory either stands up under the hardest question that can be thrown at it, or it does not. And that hardest question, the one everything now hinges on, is not whether he had power, and not whether he hid it, and not how much of it he kept. It is simpler and far more dangerous than any of those. Where exactly was the power coming from? But before we are allowed to enjoy any elegant answer to that question, the theory has to survive something it very nearly did not survive at all. It has to stand trial. Because a fair investigation does not just present the case it likes and then take a victory lap. It hauls in the prosecution, hands them the microphone, and lets them swing as hard as they can. And this particular theory has spent a century and a half getting swung at by some genuinely formidable people. So we are going to give the opponents their full day in court, no interruptions, no cheap dismissals, before the defense gets to say a single word. The first thing worth knowing about kenosis, and it tends to surprise people, is how young it actually is as a worked-out doctrine. If you have run into this idea online, it was very likely sold to you with a certain flavor of ancient mystery, a suppressed truth the church buried for 2,000 years and has been nervously guarding ever since. It makes for a great thumbnail. It is also not quite how the history went, because for the overwhelming majority of those 2,000 years, nobody had actually thought of it yet. The kenosis theory in its developed form is a distinctly modern arrival. It did not emerge from a dusty first-century scroll. It emerged, of all the unglamorous times and places, from 19th century Germany, which means the theory is younger than the steam locomotive, younger than photography, and roughly the same age as the modern bicycle. Not exactly the forbidden wisdom of the ancients that the marketing promised. The man usually credited as the father of modern kenotic theology is a German Lutheran theologian named Gottfried Thomasius, working around the middle of the 1800s. He was wrestling with precisely the puzzle we have been circling this entire time: the stubborn human limits of Jesus, the not knowing, and the tiredness and the growth. And he decided the honest move was to take those limits at face value and build a theory that could hold them. His proposal, in essence, was that the Son genuinely set aside certain divine attributes in order to live an authentic human life. From Germany, the idea drifted across the water to Britain, where it was picked up and refined in the early 20th century by thinkers such as P.T. Forsyth and H.R. Mackintosh, each of whom worked out his own careful version. This was not a fringe movement of cranks scribbling in the margins. These were serious, respected scholars publishing serious, respected books. The internet did not invent this theory, it merely rediscovered it, dusted it off, and gave it a dramatic thumbnail, which is a very internet thing to do. It is worth pausing on why this idea surfaced exactly when and where it did, because the timing is not an accident. The middle of the 19th century was the era when scholars first began studying the life of Jesus with the full toolkit of modern history, poring over the Gospels the way you might examine any ancient biography, and the effect was to throw the sheer humanity of the man into sharper relief than ever before. The tired, hungry, questioning, growing Jesus was suddenly very hard to look away from. And the older reassurances, the ones that quietly insisted he had been secretly running the full divine machinery the entire time, started to feel strained against a portrait that looked so thoroughly and stubbornly human. Thomasius and those who followed him were, in a sense, trying to build a theology honest enough to survive that new scrutiny. It also helps to know that this grew in specifically Lutheran soil, a tradition that had already spent generations arguing internally about how the divine and human natures share and exchange their properties in Christ, the very debate that produced the concealment position we met a few chapters back. Kenosis did not appear out of thin air. It grew in ground that had been tilled by centuries of exactly this argument, none of which, it must be said, settles anything by itself. There is a lazy move people make in both directions here, and it is worth naming so we can avoid it. On one side, defenders sometimes market the theory as ancient just because it leans on an ancient text, which we have just seen is misleading. But on the other side, critics sometimes treat it as false simply because it is recent, as though an idea could be disqualified for the crime of having been thought of too late. That reasoning does not hold. A genuinely correct reading of an old passage can absolutely arrive centuries after the ink has dried, and indeed the great councils themselves were, relative to the Gospels they were interpreting, very much a later development. Being new is not a sin, and being old is not a proof. The age of the theory tells us where it came from. It tells us nothing at all about whether it is right, and the only way to settle that is to keep weighing it, which is exactly what the rest of this trial does. So that is where the theory comes from, now for the part where people who dedicated their lives to defending orthodoxy tried, with considerable skill, to strangle it in its cradle. And their objections are not the flailing of people who did not understand the idea. They are the careful, targeted strikes of people who understood it perfectly well and concluded it was dangerous precisely because of what they understood. The first heavyweight to step up is a towering figure from Princeton named Charles Hodge, and his objection cuts straight to the deepest possible level, the very definition of God. Classical theology, the mainstream tradition inherited from those ancient councils and the centuries after them, holds that God is by his very nature infinite, eternal, and unchanging. And here is the crucial part. the part the whole objection hinges on. Those are not optional features that God happens to possess, like a car that happens to come with heated seats. They are what the word God means in the first place. To be God just is to be infinite, to be all-powerful, to be all-knowing, to be beyond the reach of change. Strip those away and you are no longer describing a slightly reduced God. You are describing something else entirely, something that is not God at all. So watch what Hodge does with kenosis. The theory says the Son set aside his omnipotence and his omniscience and lived within human limits. Fine, says Hodge, but follow that to its logical destination. A being who has genuinely laid down his unlimited power and his unlimited knowledge, who has become, in the memorably brutal framing Hodge chose, as helpless and as ignorant as a newborn baby, is by definition no longer infinite, no longer all-powerful, no longer all-knowing. And a being who is no longer any of those things is, by the classical definition, no longer God. You cannot have a God who stopped being God for a few decades and then started again, because the moment the stopping happened, the thing you were pointing at ceased to be the thing you claimed it was. There is also the matter of unchangeableness, which theologians call immutability. The classical God does not change ever, because change implies moving from one state to a different one, from more to less or less to more, and a perfect infinite being has nowhere to move. But a God who empties himself of attributes has, rather obviously, changed, and changed enormously, going from possessing everything to possessing considerably less. So either the classical God is wrong or the kenosis theory is, and Hodge was quite sure which one he was betting on. And there is a sting in the tail because if the Son really did stop being fully God, then he also lost the very thing that qualified him to rescue anyone in the first place, since only God can do the saving. A demoted Jesus is a Jesus who cannot deliver the rescue, which rather defeats the entire point. The second heavyweight brings an objection that is, if anything, even more alarming, because it does not just threaten Jesus, it threatens the entire structure of God. His name is Louis Berkhoff, and his worry is about the Trinity itself. Here's the setup, briefly. Classical Christianity holds that the one God exists as three persons and that the Son is one of those three, sharing the full and undivided divine nature with the Father and the Spirit. The Son is not a junior partner or a part-time deity. He is fully God, holding the complete divine nature, which is exactly what makes him one of the three. Now drop kenosis into that structure and see what happens. If the Son actually emptied out his divine attributes during his years on earth, then for that whole stretch he was not holding the full divine nature anymore. And a member of the Trinity who is no longer fully divine is a rather serious problem, because the entire arrangement depends on all three persons being fully God at all times. Subtract the deity from one of them, even temporarily, and the Godhead springs a leak. For roughly 3 decades on this reading, the Trinity would have been quietly running a member short, which is an awkward thing to have to write on the cosmic timesheet. Berkhoff pushes the knife in a little further with a practical question, too. Classical theology says the Son is the one who holds the entire universe together moment by moment, sustaining all of creation. So if he emptied that power out while he was a baby, one has to ask who exactly was minding the store. Keeping the stars burning and the atoms holding their shape, during the years the second person of the Trinity had supposedly powered himself down. The theory, as Berkhoff saw it, does not merely shrink Jesus. It destabilizes the whole doctrine of God from the inside. There was a further unease the critics voiced, quieter but pointed. Christians had from the very beginning worshipped Jesus and prayed to him. But if for the years of his earthly life the Son had genuinely emptied out his omniscience, then the prayers whispered toward the child in the manger were being offered to someone who, on that reading, could not actually hear them all, a God temporarily unable to perform the one function a prayed to God most needs. To the prosecution, this bordered on unbearable because it seemed to punch a hole in the middle of devotion itself, leaving worshippers on their knees before a deity who had, for the moment, misplaced the very capacity that made worship make sense. And in case anyone is tempted to file all this under ancient squabbles that stopped mattering long ago, it is worth noting how recent the hostility actually is. As late as 1961, the influential evangelical magazine Christianity Today lined kenosis up shoulder to shoulder with the old condemned heresies, treating it as a modern member of the same disreputable family as the ancient shortcuts we walked through several chapters back. Picture the scene as a kind of reunion of the rejected kenosis showing up as the fresh-faced new arrival, and the old errors that had been gathering dust in the condemned file for 15 centuries shuffling over to make room at the table. In other words, this was not a fight that ended in the year 400. It was still live and still fierce, well within the memory of people alive today. The reason the hostility flared up again so vigorously in the 20th century is worth a quick word, because it explains that pointed date. By the early 1900s, versions of kenosis had become fashionable in more liberal and modernist theological circles, sometimes in forms that really did chip away at the full divinity of Christ, and that alarmed the more conservative wing enormously. So when a flagship evangelical publication lined the idea up beside the old condemned errors, it was not swinging at a ghost. It was firing a shot in a live battle over the very identity of Jesus, worried that a fuzzy or careless version of the emptying was being used as a polite backdoor toward a merely human Christ. That fear was not paranoid. Some versions on offer at the time genuinely did head in that direction. The tragedy from the standpoint of the careful defenders is that the crackdown tended to sweep up the responsible version right alongside the reckless ones, condemning the whole family for the sins of its rowdiest members. When you gather all of these objections together and boil them down, they crystallize into one devastatingly simple charge, and it is worth stating in its starkest form because this is the argument the defense has to somehow answer. Strip God of his powers, the prosecution says, and you have not humbled God. You have abolished him. The powers are not decorations God happens to be wearing, ornaments you could remove while leaving the essential deity untouched. The powers are what make God God. The all-knowing and the all-powerful and the everywhere at once are not the accessories. They are the substance. So the moment you say the Son laid them down, you have not described a God who lovingly lowered himself. You have described a God who briefly ceased to exist as God and left behind someone who, however admirable, was no longer the one being in the universe capable of saving anyone. Take away the powers and there is no one left standing to do the rescuing. And it is important not to caricature the people making this case as fussy academics guarding a rulebook for its own sake. For Charles Hodge, for Louis Berkhoff, and for the editors who filed kenosis beside the ancient heresies, this was never a game of points. They believed with total sincerity that a wrong answer here would quietly rob ordinary believers of the only Savior able to save them, swapping out the living God for a noble but powerless substitute nobody had asked for. Their severity came from love, however stern its expression. And the central image behind their whole argument is genuinely hard to shake. You cannot, they were effectively saying, remove the wetness from water and still have water in front of you because the wetness is not an add-on to the water, it simply is what water is. In the very same way, they insisted, the infinite power and knowledge of God are not decorations painted over some more basic deity underneath, they are the deity. Pull them out and you are not left with a humbler God, you are left with a puddle where God used to be. That is the case for the prosecution, and it deserves to be felt at full weight, not dodged. This is not a straw man built out of cheap misreadings. These are careful, serious thinkers making a genuinely powerful argument that flows directly out of the classical picture of God, and if it is right, the whole viral theory does not just have a weakness, it has a fatal wound. For a moment, sitting there in the courtroom, it really does look like a knockout. The theory that seemed so elegant a chapter ago now appears to be quietly dismantling the very God it was trying to describe. And there the charge hangs in the air, heavy and unanswered, while the defense rises slowly to its feet. Because there is a defense, and it turns on a single distinction so clean that once you see it, a startling amount of the heat behind the prosecution simply evaporates. The critics, for all their skill, keep swinging at a version of the theory that its most careful defenders do not actually hold. It is a bit like watching someone deliver a crushing, point-by-point demolition of a car, its terrible fuel economy, its flimsy frame, its embarrassing turning circle, while the owner stands quietly to one side, pointing out that they drive a completely different model. The blows are real, they are just landing on the wrong target. Start with the gentlest form of the defense, a simple observation that reframes the whole thing. To empty yourself of the use of some of your powers is not remotely the same as emptying yourself of your identity. These are two entirely different operations, and the prosecution has quietly slid from one to the other without noticing. Consider a plain human example. There are people in this world born without arms and without legs. Nick Vujicic, a well-known speaker who lives with exactly that condition, is missing capacities that nearly every other human being simply has. He cannot do a great many things that most of us never think twice about, and yet not a single reasonable person would look at him and conclude that he is therefore less than fully human, or that his humanity has somehow been destroyed or reduced by the absence of those limbs. His identity as a complete human being is entirely intact. Certain functions are simply not part of his lived experience. Now carry that logic upward. If a person can be fully and completely human while lacking the use of arms and legs, then it is at least thinkable that the Son could be fully and completely God while, for a stretch of time, not making use of certain divine powers. Losing access to a function is not the same as losing what you fundamentally are. Being is one thing, doing is another, and the whole prosecution, in its rush, has been treating them as if they were the same thing. That gentle observation opens the door, but the real muscle of the defense is a sharper, more technical distinction. And it is the single most important idea in this entire chapter, so it is worth slowing down for. There are, it turns out, two completely different things a person can mean when they say kenosis, and everything depends on which one you're talking about. The first is what we can call ontological kenosis, ontological being the fancy word for having to do with being itself, with what something actually is. On this hard, literal version, Jesus really did destroy, discard, or genuinely cease to possess his divine attributes. He actually stopped being omniscient. He actually stopped being omnipotent, not in appearance, but in the deepest reality of his being. His divine equipment was not set down, it was thrown out. And here is the crucial concession the defense makes, and makes cheerfully. If that is what kenosis means, then the prosecution is completely correct, and Hodge and Burkhoff win in a walk. Ontological kenosis really does shrink the deity, really does change the unchangeable, really does spring the Trinity leak, exactly as advertised. A version of the theory that says the Son literally stopped being fully God is a heresy, full stop. And the careful defenders will hand you the rope to hang it with. They are not interested in defending that version at all. The second is what gets called functional or relational kenosis, and this is the version nearly every thoughtful defender actually holds. On this reading, Jesus retained every single one of his divine attributes, completely and without loss, at the level of his being. He never for one instant stopped being omniscient in who he was. He never stopped being omnipotent in who he was. Nothing was destroyed, nothing was discarded, nothing leaked out of the Trinity, and the vault stayed absolutely full. What he set aside was not the attributes themselves, but the independent exercise of them, the self-directed, self-initiated use of his own power, choosing instead to live in continual dependence on the Father and on the Spirit. The powers remained his the entire time. He simply, voluntarily declined to reach for them on his own authority. It is exactly the difference between having a capacity and using it that we noticed earlier, only now with everything riding on it. A retained but unexercised omniscience produces, from the inside and from the outside, a lived experience identical to a genuinely limited mind. A Jesus who possesses all knowledge but has resolved not to consult it looks and feels and behaves precisely like a Jesus who simply does not have it, with one enormous difference. The first one is still at every moment fully and completely God. At this point, a sharp viewer tends to raise a hand with a genuinely good objection. Hold on, they say. If Jesus had the full sweep of divine knowledge available the entire time and simply chose not to look at it, how is that any different from the hidden God view we already set aside, and does it not drag the very same authenticity problem right back in with it? It is a fair challenge, and the answer turns on a subtle but real difference. The hidden view had Jesus actively using his divine powers in secret, quietly running the machinery behind the curtain, which is exactly why his humanity started to feel like a performance. Functional kenosis says something genuinely different. It says he did not consult the reserve at all, did not run the machinery, did not peek behind the curtain, but lived entirely through the limited human window, drawing what he needed instead from the Father and the Spirit. The divine knowledge existed, fully intact, but it stayed sealed off from his day-to-day human experience rather than secretly feeding it. So the not knowing is real all the way down, the tiredness is real all the way down, the temptation is real all the way down, because in the only awareness he was actually living from, the reserve was simply not being drawn upon. He kept the power and truly did not use it, which is a very different thing from keeping the power and using it in the dark. This is not a piece of hand-waving cobbled together to escape the objections either. Serious modern philosophers have built rigorous, carefully argued versions of it. A thinker like Stephen Davis worked out precise formulations designed to hold up under exactly the kind of pressure Hodge and Berkhoff applied. And one of the most elegant contributions came from the philosopher Thomas Morris, who proposed a model often described as the two minds view. The idea is that in the single person of Christ, there operated two distinct ranges of consciousness or awareness. There was a divine mind which retained the full sweep of omniscience, complete and unbroken. And there was a human mind, which functioned within ordinary human limits, knowing what a human being in that time and place could know, growing and learning and occasionally being caught off guard. The two were not rivals jostling for the wheel, and this is not a story about a split personality flickering back and forth. The picture is more like a small, bright window set inside a vast and fully lit room. The human awareness was real and genuinely bounded. The room it sat within was complete and infinite, and the greater mind quietly held and supported the lesser one without overwhelming it or making it a fake. Jesus normally lived and operated through the human window, which is why his day-to-day experience was so authentically limited, while the divine mind remained entirely intact behind it. And notice how gracefully this dissolves a headache we ran into earlier. When we looked at the hidden God view, we hit that awkward line about not knowing the day of his return, and the two natures reply forced us into the uncomfortable position of saying the very same faculty both knew and did not know the very same fact at the very same moment, which felt suspiciously like having it both ways. The two minds model handles the same problem far more cleanly. It is not one single faculty absurdly flipping between knowing and not knowing. It is two genuinely different levels of awareness within one person, the human consciousness truly not knowing while the divine consciousness truly knows, no contradiction required, because they are not the same knower operating at the same level. The tension that felt like a dodge before now has an actual architecture to sit inside. To feel how much work this model does, run it back through the very first scene we opened with. The crowd by the sea and the desperate woman who reached for the edge of his cloak. On the two minds reading, the divine awareness in Christ knew perfectly well who had touched him and why, in the same way it knew everything else. But Jesus was not living from that awareness. He was living from the human window, and in that window the information genuinely was not present. So when he stopped and asked who had touched him, it was not a piece of theater staged for the crowd. It was a real question from the only vantage point he was actually occupying. The power that left him likewise registered in his human experience as a real and noticeable event, felt rather than coldly monitored, because that is the level he was living on. Suddenly, the scene that started this whole investigation stops being a contradiction to explain away and becomes exactly what the theory would predict: a fully divine person genuinely surprised inside his fully human life. The clue that opened the case turns out to fit the theory like a key sliding into a lock. It would be dishonest to pretend the two minds model has no critics of its own, because it certainly does. Some worry that talking about two centers of awareness inside one person drifts uncomfortably close to the old error of splitting Jesus into two, the very fence the council at Ephesus built. If the divine mind and the human mind are imagined as two independent, too much like a pair of separate people sharing a single skull, then you have quietly reinvented the mistake the church spent centuries stamping out. Defenders reply that the two minds are not two persons, but two levels of one consciousness, the greater fully containing and owning the lesser, which is why they insist it never crosses that line. Whether that reply completely satisfies is a matter of ongoing and genuinely tricky debate. The point for now is simply that the model is powerful without being unbreakable, which is a fair thing to admit about any tool this ambitious. It is telling, by the way, where this argument eventually ended up being fought. What began as a quarrel among preachers and church authorities migrated over the last century into the seminar rooms of professional philosophers, people trained to hunt down contradictions for a living. And rather than collapsing under that harder scrutiny, the careful version of the theory generally got sturdier, its claims sharpened, its weak points patched over. That is not the usual trajectory of a genuine heresy. Bad ideas tend to fall apart the moment serious logicians start poking at them. This one poked hard and poked often, mostly tightened up instead, which is at least a point worth setting on the scale. Now watch the defense turn and answer the prosecution directly, point for point. To Charles Hodge, who insisted that a God who lays down his attributes stops being God, the functional version replies that nobody laid down any attributes at all. The omnipotence was never surrendered, only left unused by the Son on his own initiative. The omniscience was never destroyed, only withheld from the human window. And declining to use a power is emphatically not the same as ceasing to have it, any more than a champion swimmer sitting quietly on the shore has stopped being able to swim. So the divine nature never actually changed at the level of its being. The infinite stayed infinite. The unchangeable stayed unchanged. Immutability survives intact because what varied was not the deity but the voluntary self-restraint of the one who fully possessed it. Hodge was demolishing the ontological version. Against the functional version, his hammer swings clean through empty air. To Louis Berkhoff, who feared the Trinity would spring a leak, the answer is even more reassuring. Since the Son never stopped being fully divine, never emptied out the actual attributes, no person ever drained out of the Godhead. All three remained fully God the entire time. The divine nature that upholds the universe was never switched off, and there was never a moment when the store went unminded, because the Son continued to be everything he had always been in his being, and whatever holding together needed doing carried right on, accomplished in full communion with the Father and the Spirit rather than by the Son grabbing the controls on his own. The leak Berkhoff warned about only appears if you assume the ontological version. Plug in the functional one, and the Trinity stays whole, watertight, and fully staffed. Step back for a moment and notice how neatly the careful version slots into those four ancient fences we inspected earlier, because this is the quiet triumph of the functional reading. The full deity stays intact since not one attribute was ever destroyed, which keeps the first fence standing. The full humanity stays intact since the limits and the lived experience were completely real, which keeps the second fence standing. And it manages this without blending the two natures into some hybrid third thing and without splitting the one person into two, because there is still just one who, the single person of the Son, freely choosing to live through his genuine human nature while his divine nature remains whole and untouched behind it. In other words, the functional version is not smuggling in a fifth option that the council somehow forgot to consider. It is a fresh way of describing a life lived within the exact boundaries the councils drew. One person acting, for a time, through the human, what, while declining to command the divine, what on his own initiative. Far from breaking the ancient rules, it turns out to be one of the more disciplined attempts anyone has ever made to honor all four of them at once. So here is where the trial lands, and it is a genuinely important verdict, stated in its careful, functional, relational form. Kenosis is not a heresy. It slips cleanly past the very objections that looked a few pages ago like a certain knockout, because those objections were aimed at a cruder version of the theory that almost no serious defender actually holds. Cut the distinction correctly between destroying an attribute and simply declining to use it, between what a being is and what a being chooses to do, and the whole prosecution case, for all its heavyweight talent, turns out to be swinging at the wrong model of car. The viral idea that looked so exposed and vulnerable in the dock a chapter ago has quietly picked itself up, and it is now wearing a rather serious suit of intellectual armor, forged by careful theologians and sharpened by professional philosophers. It also reframes the emptying itself, turning it from something that sounds like a downgrade into something that looks a great deal like the highest act of love imaginable. On the functional reading, the Son did not shrink because he had to, or because something was wrenched away from him. He restrained the use of infinite power on purpose, freely, out of a desire to stand fully alongside the people he came for. That is not weakness leaking out of God. That is strength deliberately holstered, which in almost any human moral reckoning is precisely what we mean by self-control and by love. A person who could flatten any opponent and chooses restraint is not less impressive than one who simply cannot fight. They are more. And a God who could brush aside every obstacle and instead chose to feel the full weight of a human life is, on this reading, not a diminished God at all, but the most staggering possible display of what divine love is willing to undergo. There is a quiet reward buried in the functional version too, easy to miss amid all the technical fencing, and it is probably what draws people to the theory in the first place, whether they could put words to it or not. It lets you hold two things at once that believers have always desperately wanted and rarely managed to keep in the same hand. On one side, a Christ who is fully and unreservedly God, worthy of worship, never diminished, never demoted. On the other, a Christ so thoroughly human that his fear and his exhaustion and his uncertainty are the genuine article, someone you can actually relate to rather than merely admire from a safe distance. Most theories quietly force you to loosen your grip on one of those in order to hold the other. This one, at least on paper, promises to let you keep both, which is a large part of why it refuses to die no matter how many times it gets buried. So let us be careful and precise about what this trial has and has not established, because the internet is not always careful about the difference. It has not proven the theory true. That is a separate and much bigger job, and we are nowhere near finished. What it has shown is narrower but still enormous, which is that the theory, in its disciplined functional form, is not automatically a heresy, and that the confident dismissals treating it as an obvious rerun of ancient error are aiming at the crude version rather than the careful one. Not guilty as charged is a very different verdict from proven innocent of everything forever, and an honest guide keeps those two firmly apart. The theory has earned the right to keep standing and to keep being tested. It has not yet earned a crown. Honesty does require one small admission before we move on, because the armor, though real, is not quite without a seam. There remains a genuinely hard question buried underneath all of this, one we will come back to and weigh fairly at the very end. It is the question of whether having but never using a power is even a fully coherent thing to say about a being like God in the first place, or whether for God specifically to be all-powerful might just mean to be actively exercising infinite power at every moment, so that a God who sets aside the use of it has quietly set aside more than the defense wants to admit. That is a real thorn, and we are not going to pretend it away. But it is a thorn, not a killing blow. And it does nothing to change the main result of this chapter, which is that the theory has survived its trial. It walked into the courtroom looking like a dead man and walked out on its own 2 feet, which means we are finally, at long last, allowed to return to the question we left hanging in the middle of the room, the one every single thing so far has been building toward. The theory has proven it can be held without collapsing into heresy. It has proven it can keep Jesus fully God and fully human at the same time. What it has not yet done, not even close, is explain the one thing that seemed impossible from the very start. If he truly set aside the independent use of his own divine power and truly lived as an unassisted human being, then the miracles still have to come from somewhere. The water still turned into wine. The dead man still walked out of the tomb. And the answer to where that power came from is about to reframe absolutely everything. So here it is, the move that makes the whole thing click. And it has been hiding in plain sight on nearly every page of the Gospels the entire time, disguised as a quiet devotional habit that almost nobody ever thought to look at twice. To find it, you have to notice something the accounts mention so often that it fades into the wallpaper. Over and over, in book after book, Jesus keeps slipping away to pray, and not in a casual, whenever he got a spare minute sort of way. He gets up long before sunrise while everyone else is still asleep and disappears to a lonely place. He spends entire nights out on a hillside, alone, apparently talking to no one visible. He peels off from the crowds, which is understandable, but he also peels off from his closest friends, the very people he was supposedly there to train. The pattern is relentless and slightly strange once you actually notice it. This is a man who, given a rare free evening, chose to spend it awake on a mountain by himself rather than sleeping like a reasonable person. Most of the time we file this away as a nice example of piety, the sort of thing preachers hold up to encourage everyone to pray more, which is a perfectly lovely lesson and almost certainly not the whole story. Because if the theory we have been building is correct and Jesus really was living as an unassisted human being who had set aside the independent use of his own divine power, then these prayer sessions are not a devotional flourish at all. They are the engine room. They are the single most operationally important thing he does all day. And we have been walking past them for 2,000 years admiring the scenery. Ask the obvious question that nobody asks. What is he actually doing out there? The comfortable assumption is that this is God having a warm internal conversation with God, a cozy family chat within the Trinity, pleasant but not strictly necessary, the way a phone call between two people who already know everything about each other is not exactly loaded with breaking news. But swap in the canonic picture where he is genuinely drawing nothing from his own reserve, and those solitary hours transform into something far more concrete and, frankly, far more interesting. This is where he receives his instructions. This is where he gets his supply. Out there in the dark, on the theory, two things are being handed to him from the Father. The first is the assignment, the actual brief for the day, where to go, whom to touch, what to do, and, just as importantly, what to leave alone. The second is the power itself, the charge required to carry the assignment out. Picture a field agent checking in before dawn to receive the orders for the day and be issued exactly the equipment that particular mission calls for. Or picture, more simply, a battery being charged, and not with a vague general trickle, but with a specific load calibrated for a specific task. He goes out empty and receives what he needs. Then he comes down the mountain and spends it. You can even watch this briefing pattern operate at the big hinge moments once you know to look for it. Before he chooses his 12 closest followers, a decision that would shape the entire mission, one of the accounts tells us he went up a mountain and spent the whole night in prayer, and only in the morning, having done so, did he come down and name them. Read casually, that is just a devout man taking a weighty choice seriously. Read through the supply line lens, it is something more pointed. He did not draw up the short list himself over dinner and then ask the Father to rubber stamp it. He went up empty, spent the night receiving, and came down with the names. The prayer was not preparation for the decision. The prayer was where the decision arrived. And that same shape, withdraw, receive, then act, repeats, at nearly every major turning point, like a man who never once moved without first collecting his orders. And the moment you frame it that way, one of our oldest clues suddenly snaps into perfect focus. Cast your mind back to the very first scene, the crush of the crowd, and the woman who reached for the edge of his cloak, and that peculiar detail that has been nagging at us this whole time, the sensation of power going out of him, registering like a draw on some finite, refillable tank. We noticed, way back at the start, that this was a deeply odd thing to say about an infinite God, because you cannot make a dent in an ocean, and an endless source does not so much as flicker when one person takes a sip. But it is precisely what you would expect if the power was not an infinite ocean welling up from within him, but a supplied charge, a real and measurable quantity delivered from outside for a purpose. A charge like that can be drawn down. A charge like that can be noticeably depleted by one unplanned withdrawal, which is why he felt it go. Power that a being manufactures internally out of its own infinite nature does not run low. Power that gets delivered from elsewhere for a defined mission absolutely does. The clue that opened this entire investigation has been waiting patiently for a mechanism, and here at last is one that fits it like a glove. But the real prize, the thing that should make you sit up, is what this does to the maddening puzzle that broke the partial view a few chapters ago. Remember the problem that had no answer. Why heal one man at the pool and leave a whole colonnade of others exactly as they were? Why pour out full power in one town and almost none in his own? Why walk past a beggar for years and leave the healing for a follower to perform later on his behalf? The partial view could tell us miracles were possible, but could not, for the life of it, supply a rule for when and where and how much and on whom. It just shrugged and relocated the mystery. The upload theory, for the first time, actually hands us the missing rule, and it is beautifully simple. He healed exactly the people in exactly the places that the Father assigned him to heal. No more and no less. The selectivity was never stinginess, and it was never random. It was obedience to a specific daily brief. He was not hoarding power he could have spent more freely. He was deploying, with pinpoint accuracy, the particular charge he had been given for the particular task he had been given. So the one man at the pool was, on this reading, simply the name on the assignment sheet that morning. The barren hometown was a place to which no commission had been attached. What looked like a chaotic, patchy, infuriating scatter of miracles turns out to be a precise map of the assignments handed down by the Father, and we were only calling it chaos because we did not have the map. We will take this rule and run it through the whole stack of unsolved cases shortly, but for now, notice simply that the rule exists at all, which is more than either of the earlier theories ever managed. There is a quieter and honestly more uncomfortable half of this that deserves its own moment, because we tend to skip straight past it. If the assignment told him whom to heal, then it also, by simple implication, told him whom to leave. And that means some of the most wrenching non-events in the Gospels, the sufferers he walked past, the crowds he did not clear, the needs he apparently left untouched, were not failures of compassion at all. They were obedience. He was, on this reading, capable of feeling the full pull of every need around him, the whole ocean of human hurt pressing in from all sides, and still holding to the narrow brief he had been given, doing only what he was sent to do and nothing off the sheet. That is a staggering kind of discipline, and a slightly heartbreaking one, because it means he almost certainly lay down many nights having passed by suffering he was not assigned to touch. The restraint was as costly as the power and just as real. This also casts a fascinating new light on that first great test out in the wilderness, the one where he was hungry and was invited to turn the stones at his feet into bread. On the surface, it looks like a simple temptation to break a fast. But look again through everything we have just built. The invitation was, in essence, to use power on his own initiative, to reach for the reserve and feed himself, off-brief, under his own authority, without waiting for the Father to hand him anything. In other words, the very first temptation was a temptation to abandon the whole mode of operation that defined him, to stop being the dependent son who acts only on what he receives and become, instead, a self-supplying agent grabbing the controls for himself. He refuses, and his refusal is not merely about hunger, it is about the principle. He will not act from himself, not even to eat, not even while starving, because the moment he does, the entire arrangement collapses. Seen that way, the wilderness was not a side quest. It was a direct assault on the load-bearing wall of his whole earthly life. Now, if all of this sounds like a clever framework being craftily imposed on the text from the outside, here's the part that should give you pause, because Jesus describes his own operation in almost exactly these terms, and he does it repeatedly. There is a moment where he lays it out with startling bluntness. He says the Son can do nothing by himself, nothing of his own initiative, but only what he sees the Father doing. Read that as pious poetry, and it slides right past you, a humble-sounding sentiment to nod along with. But read it through the lens we have just built, and it stops being poetry and becomes something much more like a technical job description. He is telling us the mechanism directly. He does not originate the works. He watches the Father, and he does what he sees the Father doing. He is not the source of the power. He is its executor, its hands and feet on the ground, carrying out an initiative that begins somewhere other than himself. And this is not a one-off remark he tossed out in a weak moment. He says elsewhere that the words he speaks are not his own but come from the Father, and that the works being done are the Father working through him. He hammers the same point from several angles, insisting again and again that the direction and the power are not self-generated. For a supposedly self-sufficient deity, he spends a remarkable amount of time telling everyone he is running on someone else. And that blunt line about doing nothing by himself is not stranded on its own either. It sits in the middle of a longer stretch where he keeps circling the same idea from several directions, saying that whatever the Father does, the Son likewise does, that the Father shows him everything, that he judges only as he hears. It is less a single humble aside than a sustained self-description, a man patiently explaining, to people who kept misunderstanding him, that he is a receiver and a responder rather than an origin point. If he had wanted to leave us a manual for how this whole dependent life actually functions from the inside, he could hardly have been more explicit about it. At this point, a reasonable person might get nervous and ask whether all of this has quietly demoted Jesus into just another prophet. After all, the great figures of old were also humans empowered by God to do wonders. calling down fire or parting water or reviving the occasional dead child. And if Jesus is simply a man running on borrowed power, what actually sets him apart from them? It is a fair worry, and the answer is the whole hinge of everything we established back at the trial. The difference is not in the mode of operation, which really does look similar, a human being empowered from outside. The difference is in the identity of the one doing it. A prophet is a mere human whom God fills for a task. Jesus, on this theory, is God, the Son himself, fully divine in his very being, who has voluntarily chosen to live and work the way an empowered human works. Same method, categorically different person. It is one thing for a servant to receive his marching orders from a master. It is a very different thing for the master to set aside his rank and receive the day as a servant, on purpose, out of love. So the upload theory does not shrink him into a prophet. It shows the eternal Son choosing to operate in a prophet-shaped way, which is a far more startling thing than the objection imagines. And this finally is what reframes his entire prayer life from a nice habit into a hard necessity. For most of us, prayer is a discipline, valuable and enriching, but let us be honest, also skippable in the sense that you can miss a morning and still more or less function, still make it to work, still operate your own body. For Jesus living under the terms of kenosis, prayer is nothing so optional. It is the supply line, it is the thread that keeps him connected to both his orders and his power, and if you cut it, the whole operation goes dark. He did not withdraw to those lonely places merely because he was unusually holy and wanted to leave the rest of us a good example, although he was, and he did. He withdrew because without those sessions, he had no assignment and no charge, which would leave him, in the most literal operational sense, a device with a dead battery and no instructions on the screen. Suddenly, the all-night vigils before his biggest decisions make a different kind of sense. So does the pre-dawn disappearance right before a punishing day of ministry. These are not devotional decorations sprinkled on top of the story to make him look good. They are an operative reporting in for orders and resupply before heading out into the field. His dependence was not a performance staged for our benefit. It was the actual, load-bearing condition of everything he did. Once you are tuned to this, you start to notice a rhythm running through the whole ministry that you probably never registered before, a kind of tidal pattern of out and in. He withdraws and prays, then comes and pours himself into a day of teaching and healing until he is visibly drained, then withdraws again to a lonely place, then returns and does it once more. Spend, then replenish, then spend again. It is exactly the cadence you would expect from someone operating on a supply that has to be renewed rather than an inner spring that simply never runs dry. An infinite source would have no earthly reason to keep stepping away to refill. A supplied one would have every reason, and the accounts, read with this in mind, are quietly full of that in and out rhythm, hiding the whole time under the innocent label of a busy schedule. This is, without much competition, the single most original and satisfying move the whole theory makes, because it takes a scattered handful of oddities that never quite fit together. The obsessive, solitary praying, the felt drain of power at the touch of a stranger, the baffling selectivity of the healings, the strange language of self-emptying, and it threads every one of them onto a single coherent string. One mechanism, and the loose ends stop being loose. But notice that a supply line, by its very nature, implies two more things we have not yet named. It implies a supplier, someone on the other end doing the delivering. And it implies a delivery system, some actual means by which the orders and the power travel from there to here. We have described the pipe. We have not yet asked who is at the source, or how exactly the current flows down it. And answering that turns out to open onto the deepest and honestly the most beautiful part of this entire idea. Because the supplier is not vague and neither is the delivery system. And both of them have been sitting in the text all along under a name that scholars actually use. The proposal that Jesus lived and worked by receiving power from beyond himself is not some homegrown internet invention. It corresponds to a genuine and respected area of theology, sometimes called spirit Christology, or if you want the mouthful that makes it sound more impressive at parties, pneumatological Christology. The word comes from pneuma, the Greek term for spirit or breath, and behind the intimidating label sits a fairly simple and very old question, which is how the Holy Spirit was actually operating in and through the life of Jesus. It turns out to be a lot more than a background presence, and once you start tracing it, the delivery system reveals itself with almost embarrassing clarity. And lest this all sounds suspiciously modern, it is worth saying that attention to the Spirit in the life of Jesus is not some clever gadget bolted onto the faith last Tuesday. The earliest Christian writers were keenly aware of the role the Spirit played in his ministry, and the theme has been recovered and developed with real care by respected theologians across a range of traditions in more recent times. It fell somewhat out of fashion for a long stretch, partly because, as we are about to see, later habits of reading tended to crowd the Spirit right out of the picture. But it is a serious and well-populated field, not a lonely corner of the internet, and the people working in it are simply pressing on a question the text itself keeps shoving in front of them. Here is the model in its cleanest form, a division of labor among the three persons of the Trinity so tidy it is almost suspicious. The Father commands. He issues the assignment, sets the mission, and directs the operation, which is the briefing half of what Jesus was collecting in those pre-dawn sessions. The Spirit empowers. He is the one who supplies the actual power that accomplishes the work, the charge in the battery, the current in the wire. And the Son performs. He is the one who carries it all out in the flesh, on the ground, in real time, obediently doing what he was assigned with the power he was given. The Father plans, the Spirit fuels, the Son acts. Three persons, one seamless operation, each with a distinct role. To see the machine actually turning over, take any ordinary healing and run it through the three roles. A sick person is brought to him. On this model, the Father has already set that person and that moment on the assignment, which is precisely why Jesus is there and not somewhere else that day. The Spirit supplies the actual power that will do the mending, the current in the wire. And the Son speaks the word, reaches out the hand, and the healing happens through him, in the flesh, in front of everyone watching. Three distinct roles, one instantaneous event. To the crowd, it looks like a single man saying a single sentence and a broken body obeying, which is exactly what they saw, because the other two roles leave no visible trace whatsoever. The Father is not standing there pointing. The Spirit is not glowing above the scene like stage lighting. All the coordination happens out of sight, and only the final step, the Son performing, ever surfaces where human eyes can catch it. And this is not a scheme you have to squint to find, because the biblical trail is laid out so plainly that the only real surprise is how rarely anyone connects the dots. Start at the launch. At the very beginning of his public work, when Jesus is baptized, the Spirit descends on him visibly in the form of a dove. Think about the timing of that. The equipment arrives at the exact moment the mission is about to begin. Before the first sermon, before the first healing, the Spirit shows up and settles on him, like a power source being connected right before the machine is switched on. Then comes the wilderness, and here the language gets genuinely striking. Immediately after the baptism, the Spirit sends him out into the desert to be tested, and the word that one of the accounts reaches for is not a gentle one. The Greek verb is ekbalo, and it is a blunt, forceful term, the very same word used elsewhere for casting out or expelling demons. This is not the Spirit tenderly suggesting that Jesus might benefit from a quiet retreat and some time to journal. This is closer to the Spirit propelling him, thrusting him out, driving him into the wilderness. The Spirit is unmistakably the active agent doing the moving, and Jesus is the one being moved. Even his ordeals, it seems, were Spirit-directed rather than self-chosen. It is a small thing, but a telling one, that this same forceful verb later gets used for what Jesus himself does to unclean spirits, expelling them, driving them out. The Spirit thrusts him into the desert with the very same energy he will one day expel demons through. There is a kind of family resemblance hiding in the language, a quiet hint that the Spirit-driven life is not a gentle, drifting, soft-focus affair, but something with real force behind it, a current strong enough to move a grown man straight into the last place on earth he would ever have chosen to go. Watch what happens when he comes back. He returns from that trial, one of the accounts tells us, in the power of the Spirit, not in his own recovered strength, not having toughed it out and re-emerged under his own steam, but specifically in the power of the Spirit. The text keeps quietly crediting the same source, over and over, as if it wants to make very sure we do not miss where the strength is coming from. Then he all but announces the whole arrangement out loud. Back in his hometown, he stands up in the synagogue, is handed the scroll of the prophet Isaiah, and reads out the lines that open with the declaration that the Spirit of the Lord is upon him, because he has been anointed to bring good news and to set people free. And then he rolls up the scroll, sits down, and tells the room that these words are being fulfilled right now in their hearing. Stop and appreciate what just happened. He inaugurated his entire public mission by reading a text whose first move is to name the Spirit as the power resting upon him. That is not a throwaway reading chosen at random. That is his opening statement, his mission manifesto, and its very first line identifies his power source. If you are looking for the moment he tells the world what he is running on, that is it. And it is worth lingering on what that scroll actually said, because the match is uncanny. The passage he read out did not merely name the Spirit as the power resting on him. It went on to spell out the very shape of the work that Spirit was empowering. Good news for the poor, freedom for prisoners, sight for the blind, release for the oppressed. In a single breath, in other words, he announced both his power source and his job description, and then went on to spend the following years doing precisely the work that passage had listed. The manifesto was not vague inspiration to be admired and forgotten. It was, quite literally, an accurate summary of the ministry that followed, delivered on the very first day, with the Spirit named as the one making all of it possible. There is a lovely detail buried in his very title that almost nobody stops to unpack either. The words Christ and Messiah both mean, at their root, the Anointed One. In the ancient world, when a king or a priest was set apart for his role, he was anointed, marked out, with oil poured over his head. But the anointing that actually mattered in his case, the one the title was quietly pointing at all along, was not oil at all. It was the Spirit descending and resting on him at the river. So the very name stamped on the whole religion encodes this entire idea inside itself. To call him the Christ is already, without realizing it, to call him the one anointed with the Spirit. The mechanism was hiding in the label the whole time, and we walk straight past it every single time we said his name. The thread keeps running straight through the ministry. When his opponents accuse him of casting out demons by some dark power, he corrects them with precision, insisting that he drives the demons out by the Spirit of God. He names the mechanism in the middle of a heated argument, almost in passing, as if it were obvious. The force flowing through him in the miracles is not his own retained divinity flexing. It is the Spirit of God at work. And the thread does not even stop at his death, because when the New Testament reaches for language to describe his resurrection, it credits that too, at least in part, to the Spirit, the same Spirit who raised him from the dead. From the dove at the river all the way to the empty tomb, the Spirit is the constant, the through line, the current that never switches off. Once you have seen it, you cannot read the story the old way again. Notice where the pattern finally lands, because it does not stop at the tomb. When the moment arrives that would seem to demand his own power more than any other, the moment of coming back from death, even that is not credited to Jesus reviving himself from some inner reserve. He is raised, and the New Testament repeatedly points to the Spirit as the agent who did the raising. Follow that all the way down, and it means something genuinely profound. From the dove at his baptism to the empty tomb, his entire existence was received rather than self-generated, his power received, his direction received, and at the very end even his life received back as a gift. The one who emptied himself did not, at the last, reach for the vault to rescue himself. He waited in the dark and was given life the same way he had been given everything else. That is the emptying carried through to its absolute final conclusion. There is also a reason most of us never notice the Spirit doing all this heavy lifting, and it says something a little embarrassing about our habits of reading. When we watch Jesus perform a miracle, the reflex, especially in the Western church, is to think, well, of course, he is God, so naturally he can do that, and then move briskly on. But that reflex quietly flattens the whole scene. It collapses every miracle into a simple demonstration of the Son firing his own divinity. And in doing so, it writes an entire character out of the story, namely the Spirit, whom the text keeps insisting was right there in the thick of the action. The upload lens does not add a stranger to the narrative. It restores a participant who is always named on the page and whom we had simply trained ourselves to skim past. None of this, incidentally, is a rogue reading cooked up to win an internet argument. The respected scholar Gerald Hawthorne devoted a careful and well-regarded study to exactly this case, arguing at length that Jesus lived and ministered by the power of the Holy Spirit, rather than by unilaterally firing his own divine engines. And Hawthorne adds a point that we are going to have to come back to later because it changes everything about why any of this matters to ordinary people. He argues that Jesus did this not as a one-off exception, a unique arrangement available only to him, but as a genuine model, a pattern for how a human being filled with the Spirit is actually meant to live. Hold that thought in reserve. It is a small stick of dynamite, and we will light it in due course. For now, marvel at how neatly this threads two needles that everyone assumed could not be threaded at the same time. On one side, it keeps the miracles fully, unquestionably divine. The power at work in them is the Holy Spirit, who is God, the third person of the Trinity, doing the work directly. Nobody can accuse this model of downgrading the miracles into some lesser, borrowed, merely creaturely energy, because the energy in question is God himself. A healing done by the Spirit of God is every bit as divine as a healing done by the Son firing his own power, for the excellent reason that the Spirit and the Son are equally God. So the divinity of the miracles is airtight. And on the other side, at the very same moment, it keeps Jesus fully human, because he is not reaching into a private storehouse of deity to pull these things off. He is a human being, empowered from outside by the Spirit, doing what a human being wholly surrendered to God can do. The one man does not compromise the other. Both are held fully at once. That double achievement is exactly why this model sits so comfortably inside the ancient boundary lines we walk through, the ones the councils drew to keep Jesus fully God and fully human without blending or dividing him. The deity stays intact because the Son never stopped being God, and the power flowing through him is God the Spirit. The humanity stays intact because he genuinely lived within human limits and was genuinely empowered from beyond himself, exactly as the model requires. The two natures are neither fused into a hybrid nor split into two people, because it is still one person, the Son, living through his real human nature in dependence on the Father and the Spirit. And in the same breath, it accounts for every one of those awkward limitation moments we filed away long ago. The not knowing makes sense because he was living in the human window and receiving only what the Father chose to give. The could not in his hometown makes sense because no commission and no empowerment had been issued for that place. The growth in wisdom makes sense because it was real human learning rather than a hidden reserve of all knowledge. The exhaustion makes sense because it was a real human body running on a real human supply. One single mechanism, and both the ancient rulebook and the embarrassing verses are satisfied together, which is the kind of two-birds elegance that theories rarely pull off. It is only fair to flag that this model has a cliff edge of its own, one the careful defenders take real pains to avoid. If you lean on the Spirit doing everything so hard that the Son becomes merely a passive vessel, a puppet with the Spirit pulling the strings, then you have slipped toward a very old error. The idea that Jesus was just an ordinary man whom God adopted or possessed, rather than God himself. The whole thing only stays inside the lines as long as you keep insisting that the one being empowered was, in his own being, fully divine the entire time, freely choosing this dependent mode rather than being reduced to it by force. Hold that line and the model is glorious. Drop it, and you have quietly rebuilt one of the very shortcuts the councils tore down. We will weigh how securely that line actually holds when we get to the end. And here is the last and loveliest piece, the reason we almost never noticed any of this machinery running. The three persons work together so seamlessly, so perfectly in step, that from the outside it looks for all the world as though the power is simply pouring out of Jesus alone. When you watch him heal, you see one man speak a word and one man reach out a hand, and it appears naturally that the strength is entirely his own. But underneath, on this model, every miracle is a coordinated act of all three at once, the Father directing, the Spirit supplying, the Son performing, a collaboration so flawlessly tight that the seams simply do not show. It is a little like watching a single, fluid, effortless performance and never once guessing how many people were working out of sight to make it look that easy. The unity of God is so complete that the teamwork never surfaces. You only ever see the one man on the stage, and you assume reasonably but wrongly that he is doing it all by himself. And there is something quietly moving in that invisibility if you sit with it for a second. The teamwork does not show, which means all the visible credit lands on the single figure standing on the ground. The Father, who set the whole thing in motion, takes no bow. The Spirit, who supplied the very power that did the work, does not step forward to be thanked. Both are apparently content to labor completely out of sight and let the watching crowd see only the sun. If the model is right, then even the way God performs his miracles is shot through with a kind of self-effacing humility. Three persons so unbothered about individual credit that they arrange the whole thing to look like the work of one pair of hands, which is, when you actually stop to think about it, a rather beautiful way for a God to behave. So the whole of his public life gets quietly reread from the ground up. Every healing, every exorcism, every calmed storm, every dead man called back out into the daylight stops being a solo flex of hoarded divine muscle and becomes instead a spirit-driven work, flowing through a fully human Jesus who lived his entire ministry in total, moment-by-moment dependence on the Father and the Spirit. That is a staggering shift in how to see the story, and it is elegant, and it is well-grounded, and it has real scholars behind it. But a model, however beautiful on paper, only earns its keep by the mysteries it can actually close. We have built the machine, we have named its supplier and traced its wiring. The honest thing to do now is to take it over to the pile of genuinely strange, unsolved puzzles the Gospels have left scattered around, the bizarre journeys and the pointless-looking detours and the healings that never happened, and find out whether this thing can actually crack them or whether it only sounds good until you put it to work. A theory is only worth the mysteries it can actually close, so let us open the case files and find out whether this one earns its keep. We have been quietly stacking up a pile of gospel oddities this entire time, the sort of details that get read straight past in Sunday school because stopping to ask about them tends to make the whole room shift in its seat. Now we finally have a single tool to bring to all of them at once, and the honest test is not whether it can explain the easy, expected scenes. The test is whether it can crack the genuinely weird ones, the details so strange that no comfortable reading has ever really managed to account for them. Take the strangest itinerary in the whole story, the one nobody ever seems to question. At a certain point, Jesus gathers his followers and leads them on a long, grinding trek northward, day after day on foot, away from the familiar towns of Galilee, all the way up to a remote place then known as Caesarea Philippi. And here's the part that ought to raise an eyebrow. This was not a quiet religious retreat in the countryside. Caesarea Philippi was a notorious hub of pagan worship, built around a great rock face riddled with carved niches for foreign gods, dominated by a shrine to the god Pan, sitting beside a deep cave and spring that local tradition regarded as a literal doorway to the underworld, the very gates of the realm of the dead. It was, to put it mildly, an odd choice of destination for a Jewish teacher and his students, roughly the equivalent of a pastor marching his congregation across 3 counties to hold a meeting on the front steps of the most famous temple to a rival religion in the region. And what actually happens once they arrive after all that walking? A short conversation. Jesus asks the group who people say that he is. Peter blurts out the great confession that he is the Christ, and Jesus responds by giving Simon the new name Peter, the Rock, and declaring that on this rock he will build his gathering and the gates of the underworld will not overpower it. And then, more or less, they turn around and go home. Read as an ordinary travelogue, this is baffling. You do not haul a dozen exhausted men across that much rough terrain, past who knows how many blisters and complaints, just to hand out a nickname and then reverse course. It looks like an enormous amount of effort for a very small payoff, the kind of pointless detour that in any other biography an editor would have quietly trimmed. But look at it through the lens we have built, and the strangeness dissolves into something almost breathtakingly deliberate. On this reading, the Father assigned that exact location for that exact declaration, and the assignment was anything but arbitrary. Where better to announce that a new community would be founded and would stand unbroken against the powers of death than while literally standing at a place people believed to be the doorway to death itself, surrounded by the idols of the old order? The setting was the sermon. The pagan rock face and its so-called gates of the underworld became the visual backdrop against which the whole promise landed with a force it could never have carried back home in a synagogue. The exhausting hike was not a whim. It was a march to an assigned stage, chosen for a meaning the disciples probably did not grasp until much later, if they grasped it on the walk back at all. There is one more layer to that northern journey that seals the point, and it is easy to miss if you only notice the nickname. It was right there, in that same conversation at that same pagan crossroads, that Jesus, for the first time, began to tell his followers plainly that he was going to suffer, be killed, and rise again. In other words, the far northern trip was not a random errand at all. It was the hinge of the entire story, the exact moment the whole mission pivots away from the crowds and the healings and turns its face toward the cross. You do not stumble onto a turning point that pivotal by accident, on a whim of an itinerary. If any location in the whole ministry was going to be deliberately assigned, chosen, and timed from above, it would be the one where the confession of who he was and the first announcement of how he would die both land in the same breath. The strangest detour in the Gospels turns out to be sitting directly on top of its single most important moment, which is not the sort of thing that tends to happen by coincidence. The next file in the stack we have flipped through before, and it broke a lesser theory to pieces, so it is worth seeing how this one handles it. The healing simply refused to follow any pattern that raw retained power could explain. One man is restored at a certain pool while a whole crowd of the sick lies untouched around him. In one town, every disease and every affliction is swept away and nobody goes home disappointed, while in another place almost nothing happens at all. We already saw that the idea of a personal reserve of power could tell us miracles were possible, but could never supply a rule for the maddening selectivity of them. Now the rule is simply there, and it drops into place without any strain. He healed exactly the person in exactly the place that the assignment named and no one else, not because his compassion had run out and not because his supply was randomly flickering, but because each day carried its own specific commission and its own specific charge. The lone man at the pool was the name on that morning brief. The town that saw everyone healed was a place with a broad commission attached. The barren stretches were simply not on the itinerary. What looked, under every earlier reading, like an arbitrary and slightly troubling scatter, turns out to be a precise record of where he was sent and where he was not. The selectivity was never the problem. It was the fingerprint of the mechanism. There is a companion oddity worth slotting in right here because the very same key opens it. Over and over, after healing someone or after being recognized for who he was, Jesus does the counterintuitive thing and orders the person to keep quiet about it, to tell no one, which is a peculiar marketing strategy for a man supposedly trying to launch a movement. Read as ordinary behavior, it makes very little sense, since most people with a genuine miracle on their hands want it advertised as loudly as possible. But read through the assignment frame, it fits without a wrinkle. If the mission ran on a precise schedule handed down from above, then premature publicity in the wrong place at the wrong time was simply off-brief, a way of forcing the timeline to move faster than the assignment allowed. He was not being coy for the sake of drama. He was keeping to a schedule whose pacing was not his to override, which is exactly what you would expect from a man living day to day on received orders rather than running his own campaign on his own clock. Which leads naturally to the most awkward item in the whole file, the hometown disaster, the scene where the accounts flatly state that he could not perform mighty works there. We flagged that word long ago, could not rather than would not, and noted how much heavier it is than the polite version people usually reach for. For most theories, that word is an embarrassment to be explained away because an all-powerful being who cannot do something is a contradiction that needs smoothing over. On this theory, it is not an embarrassment at all. It is exactly what the mechanism predicts. If the power for any given place was a commission that had to be issued and a charge that had to be supplied, then a place with no commission and no supply is a place where the works genuinely could not be done, in the plainest possible sense. It was not stubbornness dressed up as inability, and it was not a mysterious failure of nerve. There was simply no assignment for that town and that wall of unbelief. And so, operating as he had chosen to operate, entirely on what he received, he found there was nothing to draw on. The could not stops being a scandal and becomes a straightforward consequence of a man living on a supply line rather than an inner well. It is worth pausing on why unbelief in particular seems tangled up with that hometown failure, because at first glance the connection is odd. If the power was simply supplied on assignment, why would the doubt of the locals have anything to do with it? The likeliest answer is that the assignment itself was shaped around what the place was ready for. The mission, at its core, was never about staging a spectacle to overwhelm the skeptical. It was about calling out and meeting faith. So a town that had already made up its mind, that could not see past the boy it remembered growing up, was simply not a place where a display of power fit the purpose of the mission. and so no such commission was given for it. It was not that the doubt magically drained a battery. It was that the doubt made the place the wrong stage for that kind of work, and the assignment quietly reflected that. Then there is the case that is quietly the most uncomfortable of all, the one that only comes into focus after Jesus is gone, and it is worth handling gently because it touches real suffering. A man lame from birth had been carried to a particular temple gate day after day for years, and it was there, after Jesus had died and risen and departed, that his follower Peter stopped and healed him in an instant. We raised this earlier as a genuine problem because that gate was a busy entrance Jesus almost certainly passed more than once, which means by any honest reckoning, he very likely walked right by this suffering man and did nothing, and the healing waited to be performed later by someone else in his name. On a theory of retained personal power, that sequence is close to unbearable. A savior with the ability and the compassion strolling past a man he could have mended in a heartbeat. But on the theory we have built, the discomfort eases into something that actually makes sense. That particular healing was not on the assignment given to Jesus during his earthly mission. It belonged to a later chapter of the larger plan, a chapter that opened only after the Spirit was poured out on his followers, and it was assigned, when its time came, to Peter, now operating under a fresh commission and empowered by the same Spirit that had empowered his teacher. The man was not forgotten, and he was not neglected out of indifference. His healing simply belonged to a different page of the schedule, and the one who wrote the schedule knew which page. That is a hard truth rather than a warm one, but it is at least a coherent one, and coherence is more than any rival account offered. And here is the detail that ties the whole file together and turns it from a clever explanation into something almost devotional. The most famous prayer in the world, the one countless people recite from memory without ever slowing down to read the label, fits this entire framework like a final puzzle piece clicking home. When his followers asked him how to pray, he handed them a template, and near the very heart of it sit the lines asking that the kingdom of the Father would come and that the will of the Father would be done, here on the ground exactly as it is done in heaven. Read casually, those are just reverent words. Read in the light of everything we have traced, they are astonishing, because they are a compact summary of the exact life he himself was living. A kingdom directed by the Father, a will surrendered entirely to the Father, a self emptied of its own agenda, and filled instead with the assignment handed down from above. He was not merely teaching his students a nice devotional formula. He was, without announcing it, handing them the operating manual for the very mode of existence he had adopted, teaching them to pray their way into the same posture of receiving orders and surrendering self-will that defined every single one of his own days. The prayer is not a suggestion to be pious. It is an invitation into his own way of living. Step back and look at what just happened across these files. One single framework, quietly and without special pleading, closed the strange journey, the patchy healings, the impossible hometown, the neglected beggar, and even the most recited prayer in human history. It did not have to strain or invent a special exception for each one. It offered the same explanation every time, and every time the anomaly stopped fighting and lay down. That is what a strong theory is supposed to do. It is not merely supposed to tolerate the weird details. It is supposed to predict them, to make you think, of course, it could hardly have been otherwise. And this one, run through its stress test on the strangest evidence in the whole record, holds, which raises a question far bigger and far more personal than any puzzle about ancient itineraries. Because if this really is how he lived, then the story stops being only about him. For most of Christian history, the natural response to Jesus has been to stand at a respectful distance and worship, which makes complete sense if you picture him as God striding through the world under his own unlimited power, doing what only God could ever do. You do not imitate that. You admire it, you bow to it, and you go home knowing the gap between you and him is infinite and always will be. But if everything we have traced is right, that picture quietly shifts, and it shifts in a way that is either thrilling or terrifying depending on your mood. Because if he really did all of it as a genuine human being, hungry and tired and uncertain, drawing on nothing but the power the Spirit supplied and the assignments the Father handed down, then he is not only a savior to be worshipped from across an unbridgeable canyon. He becomes something far more demanding. He becomes a pattern, a prototype, a demonstration of what a human life wholly surrendered to God and filled with the Spirit is actually capable of. He is not just the one we are saved by. He is, in a sense, that ought to make us slightly nervous, the one we are meant to look like. And lest that sound like an overreach smuggled in at the last minute, notice that he said as much himself, in words that have made cautious readers uncomfortable for 2,000 years. He told his followers plainly that the one who trusts him would go on to do the very works he had been doing. And then he added the line that really should stop traffic, that they would do even greater works than these. Greater. That is not the sort of thing you say if your power was a unique, sealed, non-transferable divine engine that no one else could ever possess. It is exactly the sort of thing you say if the power was never really yours in the private sense to begin with, if it was the Spirit flowing through a surrendered human life, because a supply like that can flow through other surrendered lives too. And that is precisely the promise, because the same Spirit that descended on him at the river was later poured out on his followers, taking up residence in ordinary people, which means the pipeline that ran his entire ministry was not decommissioned when he left. It was extended. It is worth pausing to say what that word greater almost certainly does not mean, because it is easy to misread it into something silly. He was not promising that his followers would outmuscle him in raw spectacle, staging bigger and flashier miracles, as though the goal were to eventually top the resurrection with something even more impressive. That reading turns the whole thing into a contest and misses the point entirely. The greatness he had in mind was almost surely a matter of scope and reach rather than sheer wattage. One human being confined to one small region, walking everywhere on foot over the span of a few short years, can only touch so many lives directly. But the same power flowing through a great many surrendered lives spread across every nation and every century reaches immeasurably farther than a single ministry in a single corner of the world ever could. Greater in extent, in breadth, in the sheer number of people the current would eventually run through. Not a louder miracle, but a wider river. And this is not left as a vague hope, because the accounts describe the actual moment the pipeline got extended. Not long after he departed, his followers were gathered together when the Spirit came upon them in a rush, the very same Spirit that had descended on him at the river, now poured out on ordinary, frightened, unremarkable people. That event is the hinge on which his whole promise turns. The power source that had run his entire ministry was not switched off and locked away when he left the stage. It was distributed, handed on, opened up to everyone willing to be filled by it. The engine that drove him became, from that day forward, an engine available to the whole community he left behind, which is precisely why the beggar at the temple gate could later be healed by a fisherman rather than only by the master. The supply had been widened to include the servants. So what exactly was his real secret, the thing that made his life what it was? Here is the part that reframes everything, and it is almost the opposite of what we instinctively assume. His secret was not raw power. Power, as we have seen, was something he received rather than generated, a supply rather than a possession. His actual secret, the one genuinely transferable thing, was the complete emptying of his own self-will. A will so thoroughly surrendered, so completely fused with the will of the Father, that the two operated as a single motion with no gap between them, no moment of I would rather not, no private agenda held back in reserve. That is the engine underneath the whole life, and unlike omnipotence, it is not something reserved for God alone. It is something a human being can, in principle, grow into. The miracles were downstream, the surrender was the source. Nowhere does this land harder than in the garden on the last night, in the scene we have been carefully saving. There, facing what was coming, he is described as being in genuine anguish, sweating and pleading, asking whether there might be any other way, whether the cup in front of him could possibly pass. And then comes the sentence that is the summit of the entire life we have been describing, the quiet handing over of everything, not what I want, but what you want. Read that moment through the theory and it becomes almost unbearably close to us. If he faced that night already knowing, with unshakable divine certainty, that everything would turn out fine, then the anguish is a little hard to take seriously, a performance of dread by someone who had read the last page. But if he met it the way the theory says he lived everything, as a full human being without the divine safety net switched on, without the comforting override that guaranteed the outcome from the inside, then that agony was real, the fear was real, and the surrender cost him something real. He did not know it the way God knows things. He trusted it the way we have to trust things, in the dark, without proof. And he surrendered anyway. That is not a lesser Jesus. That is a Jesus who finally stands close enough to touch, having walked through the exact kind of darkness we walk through, and having chosen, at the bottom of it, to say yes to the Father when every human instinct was screaming for the other answer. This is where the theory does something two-edged, and it is worth naming both edges honestly. On one side, it is enormous comfort because it drags Jesus out of the safe distance and sets him down right beside us, a real human who is really afraid and really tired and really tempted and really uncertain, someone who understands our life from the inside because he actually lived it on the same terms we do. That is the warm edge. But the same move has a cold edge, and any honest account has to admit it, because the closer he stands as a genuine human model, the more mercilessly his life exposes the distance between his surrender and ours. If he was secretly running on invincible divine autopilot, then of course we cannot match him and no one expects us to. But if he did it as a surrendered human, then his life quietly holds up a mirror, and the reflection is not flattering. It shows just how far our own stubborn, self-willed, agenda-clutching hearts are from the total surrender that defined his. The theory that comforts us by bringing him near is the very same theory that convicts us by showing us how unlike him we still are. It would be a mistake, though, to hear that convicting edge as a whip. The mirror is not held up to shame anyone into despair, and the point of seeing the gap is not to leave you crushed by it. The point is to make the offer that follows actually mean something, because a rescue only lands as good news for people who have first noticed they need rescuing. The distance the mirror reveals is not the last word. It is the setup for the far better word that comes next. And this is exactly the point where the good news has to be stated carefully, because the obvious wrong turn is to hear all this as a demand to simply try harder, to grit your teeth and manufacture more surrender by sheer effort, which is roughly as promising as trying to relax by clenching. That is not the offer. The gap does not close by willpower. On the Christian account, it closes by a kind of transfer, a change of the deepest thing a person is joined to. The old story of humanity is a story of solidarity in the first man, Adam, a shared inheritance of the self-willed, God-avoiding tendency that runs in all of us by default. And the offer is to be moved by trust rather than by effort, out of that old solidarity and into a new one, joined instead to Christ, the second and truer Adam, so that his surrendered life becomes the new root you grow from rather than a standard you exhaust yourself failing to meet. Jesus, on this reading, is not merely the rescuer. He is the proof of concept, the first fully human life to be lived exactly as human life was always designed to be lived, unfallen, wholly surrendered, entirely filled with the Spirit, and therefore the living evidence that such a life is actually possible for a human being at all. He ran the demonstration so that we would know the design was not a fantasy, and then he opened the way for us to be grafted into it. That is the spiritual center of this whole strange investigation, and it is the reason the theory tends to hit people somewhere deeper than the intellect. It helps to picture those two great solidarities as two different family trees, each with its own root, feeding everything that grows from it. The first tree traces back to the first man, and its root is the old, self-directed, God-avoiding tendency that every human being inherits simply by being born into the family. No effort required, no application to fill out. The offer of the good news is not that you should climb this tree faster or prune yourself into a nicer shape by sheer determination. The offer is a transplant to be lifted out of the old root entirely and grafted into a new one, into Christ, the second and truer founder of the human family, so that the life you draw up comes from his surrendered life rather than from the old inheritance. A branch grafted into a new tree does not have to strain and grunt to produce new fruit. It simply draws from a new root, and the fruit follows on its own. That is the whole difference between trying to become like him by willpower and being joined to him by trust, and it turns out to be the difference between exhaustion and life. Now, having said all of that with real warmth, honesty requires that we not end with a victory parade, because a theory this bold has genuine weak points, and pretending otherwise would insult anyone actually thinking it through. A trustworthy guide shows you the cracks in the thing he is selling, not just the shine, so here are the real ones, stated without flinching. The first crack sits right at the foundation, in that single ancient verb the whole theory is named after. We spent a whole chapter on the 2 ways to read the great emptying, and it must be admitted that the strongest, most linguistically defensible reading may well be the metaphorical one, the sense in which someone makes themselves nothing, pours themselves out in humility, empties themselves of status and rank rather than of actual divine attributes. The same writer uses that verb elsewhere and always figuratively, never as the literal draining of a substance, which is a real point that leans against the theory rather than toward it. So the flagship text, the verse that gives the whole idea its name, is genuinely contested, and an honest defender cannot wave it around as a knockout proof. At best, it is suggestive. At worst, for the theory, it is a beautiful poem about humility that says nothing about attributes at all. The more careful defenders of the theory tend to admit this openly, which is to their credit. They do not stake everything on that single verse. They lean instead on the broad pattern we spent so long assembling, the whole accumulated weight of the tiredness and the not knowing and the received power, and they treat the disputed verse as supporting evidence rather than the cornerstone. That is the honest way to hold it, and it is a useful tell, because a defender willing to concede that his best proof text is contestable is usually a defender worth taking more seriously, not less. The second crack is the weight of the historic consensus, which is not nothing. The mainstream tradition, ever since those ancient councils, has insisted with total firmness that Jesus never for a single instant stopped being fully God. And any version of this theory that has him truly shedding or losing divine attributes, actually ceasing to possess them, walks straight across the line the councils drew and lands in the territory they condemned. 2,000 years of the most careful theological minds landing overwhelmingly on one side of a question is not a decisive proof that they were right, but it is a very good reason to be humble and slow before declaring that they all missed something a thumbnail figured out last week. And the third crack is the deepest one, the philosophical thorn we have flagged more than once and now have to actually sit with. The theory rests on the claim that he kept his divine identity while setting aside his divine powers. But that quietly assumes you can cleanly separate the powers of God from the nature of God, as if omnipotence and omniscience were removable attachments bolted onto some more basic deity underneath. And it is far from obvious that this separation is even coherent. Many would argue that the attributes are not accessories God happens to carry, but are simply what God is, so that to be God just is to be all-powerful and all-knowing at every moment, in which case a God who genuinely set aside the exercise of those things has set aside more than the theory wants to admit. That is a genuinely hard problem, and it does not have a tidy solution. There is a fourth caution worth raising, subtler than the others, and it stings a little because it targets the very thing that made the theory feel so satisfying in the first place. A framework that can explain every single anomaly, that has a ready answer for why he healed here and not there, why he went north, why he stayed silent, why the beggar waited, starts to raise a quiet warning flag of its own. An explanation that can absorb absolutely any detail, that can never be caught out because the Father simply assigned whatever happened to happen, risks being a little too flexible for its own good. If every possible outcome fits the theory equally comfortably, then the theory is not really being tested by the evidence at all. It is just draping itself neatly over whatever it finds. That does not make it false, but it does mean we ought to be a touch suspicious of how effortless it felt when it closed every case without a struggle, and honest enough to admit that a story which explains everything can sometimes, for that very reason, be proving rather less than it appears to. Which is precisely why the responsible move, if you're going to hold this theory at all, is to hold the gentler, functional version rather than the bold, literal one. The version where nothing is actually lost, where every attribute is fully retained, and only its independent use is voluntarily set aside, survives all three of these cracks far better than the version where he truly divests himself of his deity. The safe form keeps the powers and restrains their use. The reckless form gives them away and walks off the edge the council spent centuries fencing. If you take anything from all of this, let it be the discipline to hold the careful version and to resist the thrilling but dangerous one, however good it might look in a caption. It is worth remembering amid all this arguing that the people on both sides of it have usually wanted the very same thing, The critics who called the theory a heresy and the defenders who built its armor were not really enemies of each other so much as rival guardians of the same treasure. Each terrified of losing a different piece of the same Christ, one side fiercely guarding his full divinity, the other his full humanity. The disagreement is real, but it is a family disagreement about how best to honor the same person, not a war between people who love him and people who do not. That is worth keeping in view because it lowers the temperature and not coincidentally raises the odds of actually thinking clearly. And that points to the only reasonable posture to end on. Do not adopt this theory or reject it because it is trending, because a dramatic thumbnail made it sound like forbidden ancient wisdom, or because an algorithm decided it should appear in front of you tonight. Weigh it. Test it against the actual words of the text and against the long, hard-won wisdom of the historic creeds, the same way you would weigh any serious claim about something that matters. Hold what survives, set down what does not, and stay honest about the difference. There's a small irony worth naming here too. The very format that carried this idea to you, the fast, dramatic, attention-grabbing clip, is close to the worst possible vehicle for the slow, careful weighing the question actually demands. A caption has to overstate to survive the feed. A thumbnail has to promise a bombshell. None of that is built for humility or nuance or the patient sifting of evidence for and against. So the medium itself gently nudges you toward treating this as a settled revelation rather than a serious proposal with real strengths and real weaknesses, which is exactly the pressure a thoughtful person has to push back against. Take the idea out of the format that delivered it and examine it in daylight at a slower pace with the counter-arguments given fully equal time. But do not miss the strange and beautiful thing hiding at the center of all of it, the thing that survives even after every crack has been named. Even in its most careful and cautious form, this idea does not shrink Christ, it magnifies him. The instinct is to assume that a Jesus who set aside his power is somehow smaller, a diminished figure, a downgrade. It is exactly backwards. A God who strolls through human life secretly invincible, untouched by real fear, real hunger, real uncertainty, cushioned the whole way by an override he could flip at any moment, has done something impressive. But a God who lays that cushion down, who enters the whole ordeal without the net, who feels the full weight of a human life and a human death with no divine crutch to lean on and does it anyway, out of love, has done something far more staggering. The emptying is not the small version of the story, it is the overwhelming one. To carry it all with the power switched off is more astonishing than to carry it with the power humming safely in reserve, not less. Hold both of those things at once, then, the wonder and the doubt, and do not let either one crowd the other out. It is possible, and in fact it is the mark of a mature mind, to be genuinely moved by an idea and genuinely unsure of it at the very same time, to find something beautiful and still refuse to swear it is settled. The people who insist you must either swallow it whole or scoff at it entirely are offering you a false pair of doors. There is a third way to stand in front of a big idea, which is to take it seriously, feel its pull, respect its problems, and keep on thinking. So take the idea and take the doubts about it, and do the one thing the whole tradition at its best has always asked for, which is to think, to weigh, to reason, and to wrestle honestly rather than to swallow whole or dismiss on sight. The question of who Jesus was and how he lived is far too important and far too fascinating to settle with a shrug or a slogan. It deserves your actual mind. Turn it over, argue with it, sit with the discomfort and the wonder of it, and decide carefully and for yourself what you make of a God who may have chosen, out of love, to meet us with nothing in his hands but the will to obey.